I have killed 41 people, and I have never once raised my voice. And the first thing I understood when I woke up in the wrong body was that both of those facts were about to become extremely useful. Let me set the scene, because the scene is a trap, and I want you to see how a trap looks from the inside when the person you've trapped is not the person you think. There is a hotel suite, expensive and anonymous, the kind that exists so that wealthy people can do regrettable things without their own staff watching. There is a young woman on the floor, not badly hurt but well-arranged, weeping in a way that is 2 degrees too theatrical to be real. I clocked it in the first half-second, the way you clock a poorly balanced knife. There is an overturned lamp, a broken glass, the specific mise-en-scène of a violent struggle staged by someone who has never actually seen one. And there is a door coming off its hinges under the boot of a police tactical unit, camera flashes going off like a cheap strobe, and a voice shouting a name. "Julian Croft, you are under arrest for felony assault. Get on the ground, hands where we can see them." Julian Croft. That apparently was me now. I was, the previous evening, a man the world knew by a code name and never by a face. In certain circles, the circles where fortunes are decided and inconvenient people quietly stop being a problem, I was called the King. In others, the Shadow. I preferred neither. I never named myself because a man who names himself has decided to be remembered, and being remembered is a failure of the craft. I was the best there has ever been at a specific and terrible profession, and I was the best because I understood, better than any of the brutes and hotheads who called themselves my rivals, that my profession has almost nothing to do with killing. It has to do with preparation, observation, patience, reading a room so completely that by the time you act, the acting is a formality. The outcome was decided hours or weeks before. In the quiet work, no one ever sees. The kill is the last 1%. The other 99 is a man sitting very still, watching, understanding, until he knows the target better than the target knows himself. Any fool can pull a trigger. The art is in arranging the world so that the trigger barely needs pulling. I died the way men like me always die, eventually, not caught, never caught, but simply crossing a street at the wrong moment, 41 contracts deep, and finally, statistically, out of luck. A truck, a wet road, an ending with no artistry in it at all, which offended me more than the dying did. And then I opened my eyes on silk sheets in a body that was 17 years old, soft, hungover, and about to be arrested for a crime it hadn't committed, in a trap so clumsy that my first coherent thought, before the confusion, before the impossible fact of being alive, before any of it, was a professional's contempt. Amateurs. Whoever built this trap has never built one that had to survive contact with a competent person. They had built it to catch Julian Croft. And Julian Croft, it turned out, was gone. In his place, wearing his soft 17-year-old face, was a man who had spent a lifetime studying exactly this kind of arrangement from the other side, the side that builds the trap, or dismantles it, or, most often, watches it from across the street knowing every wire. I did not resist arrest. Resisting arrest is what a guilty man does, or a frightened one, and I was neither. I lay down on the floor calmly, hands visible, and I let them cuff me, and I said nothing at all, the first of a great many silences that were going to unnerve everyone around me far more than any shouting could. And while they hauled me up and read me my rights, I did what I always do, the only thing I have ever really done. I watched. I watched the victim flinch when the police helped her up, flinch away from them rather than toward them, which is wrong. A real victim reaches for the police. I watched a man in an expensive coat at the edge of the room, not police, not hotel, murmuring to the lead detective with the easy familiarity of someone who had arranged for that detective to be here. I watched the camera flashes, and I understood they were not police cameras, they were press, tipped off in advance, which no one tips off for a routine arrest. You tip off the press when the point of the arrest is not justice, but a story. I watched the whole shape of it assemble in my mind, the way a contract assembles when you finally have all the pieces. And by the time they walked me out of that suite through a corridor of flashing cameras, I knew 4 things. 1. Julian Croft was being framed. 2. The frame was not about a crime. It was about removing Julian Croft from somewhere he was inconvenient to be. 3. The people who built it were wealthy, connected, and clumsy, which is the most dangerous combination there is, because clumsy people who can buy their way out of consequences never learn to be careful and never expect the trap to bite back. And 4, they had made one mistake, the same mistake the world had made about me for 40 years. They had looked at a soft, useless, hated 17-year-old boy, and they had seen exactly what they expected to see, and they had built their entire beautiful plan on the assumption that what they saw was what they were dealing with. They were not dealing with Julian Croft anymore, they just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you what I learned about the boy whose life I'd inherited over the next 12 hours, in a holding cell, doing the thing I do, reconstructing a target from fragments, except this time the target was myself. Julian Croft was 17 years old, the only son of Benedict Thorne and his late first wife, Isabella. The Voss family was old Ashford money. The Voss Group, one of the pillars of the city, pharmaceuticals and shipping and 100 other things. Isabella Reyes had died 3 years ago when Julian was 14. And here the fragments began to arrange themselves into something ugly, because the moment I understood who had died, and when, and what had happened to the boy after, I understood the whole shape of the thing, the way you understand a body from the angle of the fall. Isabella Reyes had not merely been Benedict's wife. She had been the fortune. It was her family's money, her mind, her holdings that made the Voss Group what it was. Benedict was the name on the door and she was the engine behind it. And when she died, she left the controlling interest not to her husband, but to her son, in trust, to pass to him fully when he turned 18. Benedict retained his position, but the real ownership, the deep controlling stake, belonged to a 14-year-old boy, held in trust, ticking toward a birthday. Julian's 18th birthday was in 5 weeks, and in the 3 years since his mother's death, the boy who was about to inherit control of one of Ashford City's great fortunes had transformed, in the eyes of the entire city, from a bright, grieving child into exactly the creature the police had just arrested. A drunk, a wastrel, a violent embarrassment, a spoiled monster who assaulted women in hotel suites. The papers had a thick file on Julian Croft's descent. Bar fights, wrecked cars, cruelty to the staff. A boy rotten to the core, everyone agreed, a disgrace to his mother's memory, plainly unfit to inherit anything. I sat in that cell and I looked at the story they'd built, and because I have spent my life building exactly these kinds of stories, I saw immediately what it was. It was too clean. Real descents are messy, contradictory, full of the specific texture of a real person falling apart. This was a portfolio. A curated collection of incidents, each one just public enough, each one landing at just the right interval, building steadily and legibly toward a single conclusion that someone needed a judge to reach in the next 5 weeks. That Julian Croft was unfit, unstable, a danger to himself and others, and that control of his inheritance should therefore pass, upon a finding of incapacity or a criminal conviction, to his responsible adult guardians. Someone had spent 3 years assassinating a boy's reputation the way I'd have spent 3 weeks assassinating a man's life. Patiently, invisibly, building toward a single, clean outcome. And the felony assault charge, 5 weeks before the trust vested, was the last shot, the one that would put a 17-year-old in a cell or a psychiatric facility on his 18th birthday, unable to claim what was his, control passing to the guardians who'd spent 3 years making sure he'd never be believed. It was, I will admit, good work. Not as good as mine, but good. Whoever built it understood patience and leverage and the specific way a story about a person can become a cage. I felt something almost like professional respect, the way one craftsman respects another's joinery even while planning to burn the house down. And underneath the respect, for the first time in a very long time, I felt something else, something I had trained out of myself so thoroughly that it took me a moment to recognize it. I felt the specific cold interest of a man who has found a target he actually wants. Because here is the thing about inheriting a dead boy's body and a dead boy's enemies. I owed the Voss family nothing. I owed Julian nothing. I'd never met him. He was a stranger whose face I now wore. I could have walked away from all of it, taken the body, disappeared, used my very particular skills to build a quiet new life somewhere no one had ever heard the name Voss. That would have been the professional choice, the clean choice, the choice a man with no attachments makes. But they had built a beautiful, patient 3-year trap to destroy a grieving 14-year-old boy and steal his dead mother's legacy. And they had built it clumsily enough to bite. And they had just handed the whole thing to the one person in the world equipped to take it apart move by move. And something in me, some old buried thing from before I was a weapon, before the code names, before the 41, wanted quite badly to watch these clever, clumsy people discover what it feels like when the trap you built for a boy closes instead on you. I was not going to break out of that cell. Breaking out is loud and stupid, and exactly what the violent Julian Croft they'd built would do, which meant it was exactly what they were waiting for. I was not going to raise a hand to anyone. Raising a hand was their whole strategy. They needed me violent, needed me to confirm the story, and I have never in my life given an enemy the thing they were waiting for. I was going to do the opposite of everything they expected. I was going to be calm and courteous and precise. I was going to walk out of this the way I walk out of everything, quietly, having already won before anyone realized the game had started. And I was going to take apart the conspiracy against Julian Croft in exactly 3 moves, the way I take apart everything, because I have never needed more than 3 moves for anything that mattered, and because 3 is the number of moves it takes to make an enemy destroy himself while your own hands stay clean. Move 1. Get out of the cage and turn their trap into the first crack in their story. Move 2. Turn the conspirators against each other so the conspiracy eats itself. Move 3. Make the architect of all of it expose himself, publicly, completely, and hand me the victory with his own trembling hand. No violence. Not one raised hand. A king of assassins does not need to kill to end you. That was always the amateur's misunderstanding of my trade. The kill is the last 1%. The other 99 is watching and understanding and arranging the world so that the people who wronged a dead boy walk, one careful step at a time, off a cliff they built themselves. I spent the hours in that holding cell doing the thing I've done in 10,000 rooms, which is the thing my whole profession is actually made of, and which I want to explain properly, because everyone gets it wrong. People imagine my former trade as a matter of moments, the shot, the blade, the instant of violence. That instant is real, but it is trivial. It is the period at the end of a sentence that took weeks to write. The actual work, the work that made me the king, is the work of reconstruction, taking a person you've never met and building them, completely, in your mind, out of fragments, the way they hold a glass, the route they take home, the people they fear, the debts they carry, the specific small vanities that will, at the crucial moment, make them predictable. By the time I ever acted, I knew the target better than their spouse did, better than they knew themselves, because I'd watched them without the distortion of loving them or being them. And a person you know that completely has no defense left, because every defense a person has is built out of the parts of themselves they can't see, and I could see all of them. In the cell, I turned that lifetime of craft on the one target I'd never had before. Myself, Julian Croft. I reconstructed him from the fragments the holding cell offered, the soft, untrained body, the hangover, the phone the police had confiscated, the memories that came in flashes as my mind settled into the borrowed neural architecture. I learned him the way I'd learned 41 strangers, and what I built over those hours was not the monster the papers described. The body remembered things the papers didn't. It remembered flinching, a deep, trained flinch, the body memory of someone who'd been shouted at, belittled, made small, over and over, until the flinch became reflex. That is not the body of a spoiled tyrant. A tyrant's body doesn't flinch, it expects to be obeyed. This was the body of someone who'd been systematically diminished, and I knew that body, because I'd spent my childhood being trained into a version of it. And the recognition was the first crack in the story the world had told about Julian Croft. And the hands. The body's hands knew things too, a callous pattern from writing, endless writing, the hands of someone who filled notebooks. Not the hands of a drunk, the hands of a boy who wrote and wrote, documenting something, obsessively, the way I documented targets, the way his mother had documented her own murder. I sat in that cell and felt Julian's writer's calluses on Julian's soft hands, and I understood, before Benedict ever told me a word, that whoever this boy had really been, he had spent his ruined years not drinking but writing, trying to build a case, trying to prove a truth, alone, in a hand that had worn calluses into the effort. The papers said wastrel, the body said witness, and I have learned in 40 years to trust the body over the paper every single time, because paper is what people write about you, and the body is what actually happened to you. By the time the detective came to gloat, I had reconstructed Julian Croft as thoroughly as I'd ever reconstructed a target, and the reconstruction told me a story so different from the official one that the gap between them was itself the largest piece of evidence in the entire case. When the story a powerful family tells about a person is that far from the truth the person's own body remembers, you are not looking at a decline. You are looking at a construction, and a construction has a builder, and a builder can be found, and found builders can be made to stand at last in a room they cannot leave and account for what they built. The detective came to my cell to gloat a little, the way small men do when they think they're holding something. He leaned against the bars and told me the evidence was overwhelming, that my family was very disappointed, that a good lawyer might get me into a nice facility instead of a prison, that I should think very hard about cooperating. I looked up at him from the bench. I did not glare. I did not threaten. I gave him the small, patient, pleasant expression I have given men in the last seconds before they understood how completely they had already lost, and I spoke for the first time since the hotel suite, in a voice with no 17-year-old anywhere in it. "Thank you," I said. "You've been very helpful. You've told me the press was here before I was arrested, which means someone planned the story before the crime. You've told me my family is disappointed, which means my family knew before you called them. And you've told me there's a nice facility already picked out, which means the outcome was arranged before the evidence existed." I stood, unhurried, and walked to the bars, and the detective, who had come to gloat at a frightened boy, took an involuntary step back from something in my face that his instincts understood before his mind did. "You've just confirmed a conspiracy in 3 sentences, detective, and you don't even know which side you're on. Don't worry, I'm not going to hold it against you. You're not the target," I smiled. "You're just the first move." Act 2. The contract. Every job begins the same way, whether the target is a man or a conspiracy. You do nothing. For as long as you can stand it, you do nothing but watch. Because the single most common way amateurs die in my former profession is by acting before they understand. And the single most common way they fail is by mistaking the loudest threat for the real one. So before I made a single move, I spent the first day back among the Voss family doing the only thing that has ever kept me alive. I studied the room. They posted bail the next morning, of course they did. A boy in a cell can claim he was mistreated, and they needed me home, in the gilded cage, where the story they were telling could keep being told with me inside it. A car came, a driver I didn't know, and a lawyer sent by the family, a smooth silver man named Vance, who introduced himself as the family's counsel, and who spent the entire ride explaining to me gently, as one explains to a child, how much trouble I was in, and how the family was going to take care of everything if I would simply trust them and keep quiet and let the adults handle it. I let him talk. Letting people talk is free reconnaissance. A man explaining how he's going to help you tells you, if you listen correctly, exactly how he's going to hurt you. And Vance told me a great deal. He told me the family wanted me to plead, to accept a quiet resolution, a stint in a private facility for my own good, which would keep the assault charge out of open court and out of the papers. He told me this as a mercy, and I understood that the facility was the whole point, that a criminal trial was risky. A trial had a jury and a defense and an acquittal. But a boy who voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric facility on the advice of his loving family was a boy declared unfit without any of the inconvenience of proving it. They didn't want a conviction. They wanted a diagnosis. A conviction I could appeal. A diagnosis, entered on my own signature 5 weeks before my birthday, would transfer control of the trust to my guardians permanently, cleanly, unappealably. "I'll consider it," I said, which is what you say when you have already decided the opposite, but want the enemy to keep believing you're pliable. Vance smiled, relieved, and made a note, and I watched him make it, and I read the shape of him. A fixer, well paid, not the architect but a competent instrument, the kind of man who would abandon whoever hired him the instant it became more profitable to. A tool, not a principal. Useful later. Filed. I made one rule for myself that first day, and I held it through the entire job. And I want to state it plainly because it's the discipline the whole thing ran on. No matter what they did, I would not raise a hand. Not once. Not to defend myself, not to punish, not even in the moment it would have been easiest and most satisfying. The rule was not about morality. I've killed 41 people. I'm in no position to lecture anyone about the sanctity of violence. The rule was about strategy, and it was the deepest strategy I know. Because the entire Voss conspiracy was built to produce one thing, a violent, unstable Julian. Every provocation, every insult, every trap was designed to make the boy lash out. Because a boy who lashes out confirms the story, and a confirmed story is a cage. Violence, from me, was the one move that could lose the entire game, because it was the one move they were prepared for, the one move that fit their narrative, the one move that turned their lie into truth. They needed me to raise a hand. It was the keystone of their whole design. And so the single most devastating thing I could do, more devastating than any blow, was to simply calmly never give it to them. To absorb every provocation with a stillness that made the provocation look like what it was. To let them build a cage for a violent boy and then refuse indefinitely to be violent until the cage stood there empty and obvious, a trap with nothing in it, visible to everyone as the trap it had always been. There's a paradox at the center of this that took me 40 years to fully understand, and the Voss job proved it perfectly. The people most desperate to provoke your violence are the people who most need you to be violent, which means your calm is the exact thing they cannot survive. A man building a case that you're dangerous is a man who is helpless against your gentleness, because your gentleness dismantles his entire premise, publicly, every day, for free. Duncan spent 3 years constructing a violent Julian. All I had to do to destroy 3 years of construction was to be visibly, unmistakably, in front of everyone, not that. The refusal to raise a hand wasn't passivity. It was the most aggressive thing I could possibly do because it aimed itself precisely at the foundation of everything they'd built, and it could not be countered because the only counter to a calm man is to provoke him. And provocation was the very thing my calm was immune to. So they pushed, and I did not push back. And every push that met stillness instead of violence was a push that rebounded onto the pusher, until the whole household was full of people who had thrown their weight against a door that turned out to be a wall, and stumbled, and revealed themselves in the stumbling. The king never raised his hand at the Voss family. The king simply refused to give them the one thing their entire plan required and let the plan collapse under the weight of its own unmet need. That's the discipline. That's the imba, if you want to call it that, though I'd call it the oldest wisdom in my trade. The man who cannot be provoked has already won, because provocation is the only weapon most people have, and it is useless against stillness. And stillness is a thing you can choose, every second, no matter what they do. The Voss estate was a great pale house on a hill, because they always are. And walking into it, I did the thing I do walking into any space I intend to work in. I mapped it. Not the rooms, the people. Where they stood, who they looked at before they spoke, whose approval each of them sought. The invisible architecture of fear and want that holds every family together, and, more usefully, the fault lines along which it can be made to come apart. There were 4 of them who mattered, and I read all 4 in the first hour. Clara Sterling, the stepmother. Benedict's second wife, married 18 months after Isabella died, which is fast. Fast enough to suggest the marriage had been arranged before the first wife's body was cold. Beautiful, poised, and watchful in a way that most people would have read as maternal concern, and I read as inventory taking. Clara looked at me, the returned, disgraced boy, with a perfect expression of wounded love. And underneath it, I saw a woman calculating whether I was still going to break the way I was supposed to break. She was a principal. Not the architect, she lacked the specific stillness of a person who plans for years, but a principal, invested, in it for herself. Liam, Clara's son from a previous marriage, 19, installed in the Voss house as a kind of shadow heir, the responsible young man the family kept holding up against my disgrace. Liam looked at me with open contempt and a nervousness he couldn't hide, and I understood him instantly and dismissed him almost as fast. A beneficiary, not a builder. A young man being handed a fortune by his mother's scheme who was just clever enough to know he hadn't earned it and just weak enough to spend his life pretending he had. A piece, not a player. But a useful piece, because frightened beneficiaries are the easiest people in the world to turn. Duncan Steele, Benedict's younger brother, the uncle. And here I slowed down because Duncan was different. Duncan did not perform concern. Duncan sat quietly at the edge of the room, watching me the way I was watching everyone. And when our eyes met, something passed between us, a flicker of recognition, one careful man clocking another. Duncan ran the operational side of the Voss Group, the day-to-day, the machinery. He was patient, precise, and entirely unhurried. And every instinct I had, honed over 40 years and 41 contracts, said, there. That one. That's the architect. The 3-year assassination of a boy's reputation had the specific patient signature of a man like Duncan, a man who understood that you don't destroy someone in a day, you destroy them in installments, so gradually that by the end everyone believes they simply rotted on their own. And the fourth, Benedict Thorne, the father, the patriarch. And the moment I saw Benedict, the shape of the whole thing shifted, because Benedict Thorne was dying. Not metaphorically, genuinely. He sat in a chair by the window, thin and gray and diminished, an old man well before his time, and I recognized the specific quality of his decline the way I recognize most things, professionally. Benedict Thorne was being poisoned, slowly, carefully. The subtle wasting, the confusion, the good days and bad days that let everyone say he's just getting old. I had used exactly that method myself, twice, on contracts that required a death to look natural. Someone was killing Benedict Thorne by degrees and doing it competently, and it was working. And no one in that house of watchers had noticed because they weren't looking at the patriarch as a target. They were looking at me. I filed that too. It changed the arithmetic considerably. Because a conspiracy to disinherit a boy is one thing. A conspiracy to disinherit a boy while quietly murdering his father is a different and much larger animal. And it told me that whoever was truly running this, Duncan, almost certainly Duncan, was not playing for a piece of the Voss fortune. He was playing for all of it. Remove Benedict, remove Julian, install the malleable Clara and her weak son Liam as the grateful figureheads, and rule the whole empire from the operational chair he already sat in, forever, with clean hands and a tragic face. I had walked into a much better target than I'd hoped. I want to show you how I read Duncan Steele, specifically, because reading Duncan is the whole reason I beat him, and because it's the clearest demonstration I can give of the difference between watching a person and merely looking at one. Everyone in that house looked at Duncan and saw the same thing. The reliable brother, the operational backbone, the unglamorous man who kept the machine running while the family played at being important. That was the surface Duncan had spent 20 years building, and it was excellent camouflage, because it made him invisible in the specific way that useful people are invisible. Nobody suspects the man who does the actual work, because we're trained to look for villains in the people who reach for glory, not the ones who quietly reach for control. But I don't look at surfaces. I watch. And watching Duncan over that first week, I collected the small things that surfaces can't hide. I watched him at dinner, and I noticed that Duncan never reached for anything at the table, never asked for the salt, never poured his own wine. Not because he was served, but because Duncan had trained himself, deeply, to never visibly want. A man who never reaches is a man who has decided that visible desire is a vulnerability, and a man who's decided that has something he wants so badly that he's built his whole self around never letting it show. That's not the psychology of a contented backbone. That's the psychology of a man consumed by an ambition he's disciplined into total invisibility. I'd seen it before. I'd been it, in a way. It takes one to know one. I watched how the others moved around him, which tells you more than how a man moves himself. Clara, who thought she was his partner, oriented toward Duncan the way you orient toward a superior you're pretending is an equal. A half-second of checking his reaction before committing to her own. Liam flinched from him. The staff went quiet when he entered. Even Benedict, poisoned and confused, deferred to his brother with the specific worn deference of a man who's been managed for decades. The whole house arranged itself around Duncan's stillness the way iron filings arrange around a magnet nobody can see. On the surface, Benedict was the patriarch and Duncan the loyal deputy. In the actual physics of the room, Duncan was the center of gravity, and everyone else was in orbit, and had been for years, and didn't consciously know it. That's real power, not the power that announces itself, but the power that has quietly become the thing everyone else's behavior is shaped by. The most dangerous man in any house is the one the house has organized itself around without noticing. And I watched Duncan watch me, which was the final confirmation, because it was the only mirror in the house. Everyone else watched the disgraced boy with contempt or pity or calculation. Duncan watched me the way I watch targets, economically, completely, giving nothing away, filing everything. In the first hour, I caught him clocking things about me that no one else in that house was equipped to notice. The way I'd stopped flinching, the way I held stillness, the way I read the room back. He was the only one who sensed, from the very beginning, that something behind the boy's face had changed, because he was the only one whose own craft was close enough to mine to feel it. That's what made him worthy of the full weight of what I could do, and it's also precisely what doomed him, because a man who watches as well as Duncan did should have known better than to underestimate a fellow watcher, and his one fatal vanity was that he could not quite believe anyone in that house of sheep was a wolf like him. He saw the change in me and he filed it. And then his pride quietly overruled his instinct, because the alternative, that the boy he'd spent 3 years destroying was now something more dangerous than himself, was a thought Duncan Steele's ego could not hold. That's the thing about the very careful. Their carefulness has one blind spot, and it is always, always themselves. There was one more person in that house who mattered, though not to the conspiracy. I met him that first evening, in the kitchen, where I'd gone because a man learns more in a great house's kitchen in an hour than in its drawing room in a week. An old man, easily 70, in the plain dark clothes of a senior servant, polishing silver that didn't need polishing because polishing silver is what men do with their hands when their hearts are breaking. Mr. Adebayo. He had been Isabella Reyes's head of household for 30 years, since before Julian was born, and he had stayed on after her death out of a loyalty that the new regime tolerated because firing him would have looked cruel, and they preferred to look kind. Adebayo looked up when I came in, and I watched his face do something complicated, a flash of the old contempt everyone wore for the disgraced young master, and then, underneath it, quickly hidden, something else. Grief. And beneath the grief, buried so deep he'd probably stopped admitting it to himself, a small, stubborn ember of hope that had refused for 3 years to go out. "You're back," he said flatly. "They said you'd been arrested." "I was," I said. "I'm out, for now." I sat down across from him at the servants' table, which the real Julian Croft had surely never once done, and I watched Adebayo register the wrongness of it, the disgraced heir, sitting in the kitchen like a person. "You served my mother." Something moved behind his eyes at my mother, at the specific way I said it, which was not the way the wastrel Julian said anything. 30 years, he said carefully. "I served Madame Isabella 30 years. And you," he stopped himself, "and me you've watched turn into something she'd have been ashamed of," I finished. "For 3 years. Go ahead. You've earned the right to say it." Adebayo set down the silver, and he looked at me for a long, long moment, the way you look at a familiar face when something about it has changed and you can't name what. And then he said, very quietly, the thing that told me I'd found my one ally in that house of watchers, the thing that told me the ember had never gone out. "Madame Isabella used to say her son had her eyes. I stopped seeing her in you a long time ago. The drinking, the tempers, the cruelty, it wasn't him. It wasn't the boy I helped raise. I told myself grief broke him. But grief doesn't work like that, sir, not all at once, not so cleanly, not right when—" He stopped again, and his old hands trembled. "I've watched them turn that boy into a monster for 3 years, and I've been too old and too afraid and too alone to say a single word about it. And now you walk into my kitchen and sit at my table and look at me with her eyes. Really look, the way that boy hasn't looked at anyone since she died, and his voice broke. Who are you? Because you're not the young master who left this house yesterday. I've served this family 30 years. I know exactly what he is, and you're not him." Careful now. This was the most dangerous moment of the first day. A witness who had seen the change, whose loyalty I needed, and whose suspicion I could not afford. A lesser operator would have lied, would have insisted I was Julian, would have performed. But I have learned that the most disarming thing in the world, to a man braced for a lie, is a piece of the truth he isn't expecting. "You're right," I said. "I'm not the boy who left yesterday. Something happened to me the night of the arrest. I won't insult you by explaining it, because I can't explain it in a way you'd believe. But I'll tell you the part that's true and that matters." I held his eyes. Whatever I am now, I woke up in this house understanding two things with total clarity. That the boy you helped raise was murdered slowly, in public, over 3 years, by people who wanted what his mother left him. And that his father is being murdered slowly, in private, right now, in that chair by the window, by the same people. And I have decided, for reasons I don't fully understand myself, that I'm going to take every one of them apart for it. I leaned forward. "I need one thing from you, Adebayo. Not your trust. You don't owe me that, and you're wise not to give it yet. I need your eyes. 30 years in this house. You've seen everything. You've said nothing because there was no one to say it to. Well, now there's someone. Tell me what you've seen. And then watch what I do with it, and decide for yourself over time whether the thing wearing the young master's face is worth helping." I stood. "I don't need you to believe I'm on the boy's side. I need you to watch me act, and let the acting convince you. That's all. That's how trust should be earned anyway. Not with words. With moves." Adebayo looked at me for a long time, and then he picked up the silver again, and he was quiet, and I thought I'd lost him, and then, still polishing, not looking at me, he said, in the low, careful voice of a man committing an act of rebellion 30 years overdue, "The poison's in the master's evening medicine. I've suspected for 4 months and been too frightened to test it. The nurse who administers it was hired by Mr. Duncan, and there's a room in the East Wing, sir, that Madame Isabella kept locked, that Mr. Duncan has had searched 3 times since she died and never found what he was looking for, because I moved it the week she passed, because she told me to, because she told me—" His voice dropped to almost nothing. "She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I was to keep it safe until her son was old enough to understand what to do with it. And I've kept it, sir. 3 years, waiting for a version of that boy who could understand." He finally looked up at me, and the ember was aflame now, small and fierce and 30 years deep. "I don't know what you are, but you're the first person to walk into this house in 3 years who I think might actually be him enough to be trusted with it. So, there's your first move, whoever you are. The master is being poisoned, the architect is the uncle, and the dead woman left her son a weapon that no one has been able to find." I looked at the old man who had guarded a dead woman's secret for 3 years, alone, waiting for someone worthy to hand it to. And for the first time since I'd woken up in the wrong body, I felt the specific, clean click of a job coming into focus. All the pieces on the board at last, the target identified, the leverage located, the end game visible 3 moves out. "Thank you," I said. "You've just made this considerably easier." I paused at the kitchen door. "Keep the weapon hidden a little longer. I'll need it, but not yet. A weapon revealed too early is just a warning. And Adebayo?" He looked up. "Start pouring the master's evening medicine down the sink. Replace it with something harmless. Do it quietly, starting tonight. We're going to keep Benedict Thorne alive. A living father is the one thing their entire plan can't survive, and they don't know we know he's dying. That's move 1, and it's already begun, and none of them will feel it for weeks." I went up to the bedroom that had been Julian's, and I did not sleep because I don't much. I sat in the dark, and I laid out the whole board, all of it, the poison and the trust and the frame and the 4 players and the dead woman's hidden weapon, and I felt something I had not felt in the 40 years since they'd first made me into a weapon. I felt like I was working for the right side. I'd never had a side. A weapon doesn't have a side, it has an owner. And for the first time, wearing a dead boy's face in a house full of the people who'd murdered him by installments, I had chosen a side, freely, for no fee and no reason, except that a locked room and a frightened old man and a dead woman's love had reached across 3 years and asked me to. Move 1 had begun. Nobody had raised a hand, and that was exactly how it was going to end, too. Act 3, the first move. Move 1 had 2 objectives, and the elegance of it, I say this without modesty, because modesty is a luxury for people who don't have to be precise, was that a single action accomplished both. Objective 1. Destroy the assault charge so they couldn't put Julian in a facility before his birthday. Objective 2. Do it in a way that made the conspirators tell me, through their reactions, exactly which of them was which. A good first move is never just a move. It's also a question you ask the board, and the way the pieces jump tells you everything about the game. Here is what the amateurs who built the frame never understood, and what my whole former profession is built on. A frame is not a wall. A frame is a story, and a story has an author, and an author leaves fingerprints. The felony assault charge against Julian Croft rested entirely on a young woman weeping in a hotel suite, a set of staged evidence, and a press narrative arranged in advance. Every one of those was a person who could be found, and every person is a pressure point, and I do not break pressure points with force. I simply find the one who is holding the least, and I let them go first. The weeping young woman was named Maya Ashton. It took me an afternoon to find her, because I had Adebayo, who had eyes in every service entrance in the city, and because a staged victim is always chosen from a specific population. Someone with a debt, a vulnerability, a reason to do a terrible thing for money, and then regret it. Maya Ashton was an aspiring actress, 22, drowning in the specific debts that drown aspiring actors, who had been paid, I would learn, a sum that seemed enormous to her, and was pocket change to the Voss family, to spend 20 minutes in a hotel suite and cry convincingly for the cameras. I did not threaten her. I want to be very clear about this because it is the center of everything, the thing that separates what I did from what a thug would do. A thug goes to the false witness and frightens her into recanting, and a frightened witness is worthless because a witness frightened into one story can be frightened into another, and a recantation obtained by force falls apart the moment someone applies more force. I have never in my life obtained anything by force that force couldn't take back. I went to Maya Ashton and I bought her coffee, and I told her the truth. You were paid to help destroy a 17-year-old boy, I said, and I don't think you fully understood that when you took the money, and I think it's been sitting badly with you since, because you keep touching the spot on your wrist where they told you to say I grabbed you, and people don't do that about a lie they're at peace with. She went white. I kept my voice gentle the way I keep it always. I'm not here to threaten you. If I threatened you, you'd cling harder to their story, because their story is where the money is, and the money is where your safety is, and fear makes people cling to safety. So I'm not going to make you afraid. I'm going to make you a better offer than they did, and it isn't money. What could possibly be better than not being the woman who helped murder a child's future for a car payment, I said. That's the offer. You're 22. You have 50 years ahead of you to be either the person who told the truth or the person who didn't. I can protect you completely from them. I have resources you can't imagine, and I will spend every one on this, but only if you choose to be the first kind of person, and only if you choose it, because a truth I frighten out of you is worthless, and a truth you decide to tell is a wall they can't climb. I slid a card across the table, a lawyer's card, not Vance's, a real one, mine. You don't owe me anything. You owe yourself the version of the next 50 years where you got to be the one who fixed it instead of the one who did it. Call her when you're ready. And Maya, you'll be ready sooner than you think, because you've been ready since the moment you took the money. You just needed someone to make it safe to admit it. She called the lawyer that night. That is move 1, the whole philosophy of it in a single conversation. I did not fight the frame. I found the one person in it who was holding the least and hating it the most, and I made telling the truth safer and cleaner than continuing the lie, and I let her choose it freely so that the choice would hold. Maya Ashton gave a sworn statement, video, notarized, unimpeachable, detailing exactly who had paid her, and how much, and what she'd been told to do and say. She named the intermediary. She described the staging, and she did it not as a frightened woman recanting under pressure, but as a young person coming forward in an attack of conscience, which is the one kind of witness no amount of Voss money can shake, because there's nothing to shake. She wanted to tell it. I did not go to the police with it. That was the second layer of move 1, and it's where the frame became the first crack in their story instead of merely a failed attack. If I'd handed Maya's statement to the police, the Voss family would have buried it. They'd tipped the press and prearranged the facility, which meant they owned pieces of the machinery, And a statement that goes into a machine your enemy owns comes out however your enemy wants. So I didn't put it into their machine. I put it into mine. I sat on it. I let the criminal case proceed. Let Vance keep gently pushing me toward the quiet resolution of the facility. Let Clara keep wearing her wounded mother face, and Duncan keep watching from the edge of the room. Let all of them keep believing the frame was holding and the boy was breaking. And then, at the arraignment, the public hearing, with the press they themselves had invited sitting right there in the gallery, the press they'd summoned to watch Julian Croft be destroyed, I had my real lawyer stand up and enter Maya Ashton's sworn statement into the open court record, live, in front of the very cameras the Voss family had arranged to tell their story. They had built a stage to destroy Julian Croft on. I simply waited until they'd assembled the whole audience, and then I performed a different play. The reversal was total, and it was public, and it was clean, and I did not raise my voice once. The assault charge did not just collapse, it inverted. In the space of a single hearing, the story went from spoiled heir assaults woman to grieving orphan framed by his own family. And it went there in front of the exact cameras the Vosses had invited, using the exact victim they'd hired. And there was nothing they could do to stop it, because stopping it would have meant admitting they controlled the machinery, which was the one thing they could never admit. I turned their own audience, their own witness, and their own stage against them in a single move, and I did it by fighting nothing and simply letting their own construction fall on them. But the reversal was never the point. I could have destroyed the frame a dozen ways. The point was the question I'd ask the board, and now I got to watch the pieces jump. And the jumping told me everything. Clara panicked, visibly, badly, the specific panic of a principal who's invested and exposed and not in control of the machinery she thought she was riding. Within a day, she was making calls, demanding to know how this had happened, turning on Vance, turning on the intermediary who'd hired Maya. A principal confirmed, and a brittle one, she would break under pressure, and she would break loudly, and she would take others down with her when she went. Filed. Liam panicked worse, but privately, the panic of a beneficiary who's just watched the fortune he was promised wobble and who is beginning to suspect he's tied to a sinking scheme. He came to me, actually, cornered me, 2 days after the arraignment, trying to look threatening and managing only frightened, and he said, "Whatever you think you're doing, it won't work, my mother and I," and stopped himself. And in the stopping, he told me everything, that he knew, that he was in it, and that he was terrified. A piece ready to turn. Filed. Vance vanished. The smooth, silver lawyer, sensing the wind change, simply stopped returning calls, began the quiet professional distancing of a fixer who's decided his client is a liability. Exactly as I'd read him. A tool with no loyalty, already loosening from the hand that held it. Filed, I'd use that looseness in move 2. And Duncan did nothing. That was the tell that confirmed everything. In a house of panicking pieces, Duncan Steele did not panic. He watched the frame collapse, watched Clara come apart, and Liam sweat and Vance slink away, and he did nothing at all. Except, once, across a room, the day after the arraignment, look at me. Just look. A long, still, evaluating look, one careful man to another. The look of a predator who has just realized the thing he'd filed as prey has teeth, and is recalculating, and is not afraid, only interested. He inclined his head very slightly, a fraction of a bow. Acknowledgement. Respect, even. The respect of an architect for another architect who has just, unexpectedly, kicked out a load-bearing wall. And I inclined my head back, the same fraction, because we understood each other now, Duncan and I, in the way that only two people who build these kinds of things can. The amateurs were panicking, but the architect had just been informed that the game was real, and I had learned the most important thing move one could teach me. That of everyone in that house, Duncan Steele was the only one who was not afraid of me, which meant Duncan Steele was the only one worth the full weight of what I could do. The night after the arraignment, before Adebayo found me, I did something that had nothing to do with strategy, and I want to include it because it's the moment the job stopped being only a job. I read Julian's notebooks. The writer's calluses had told me they existed, and it took Adebayo an evening to find them, hidden, the way a boy hides the thing that's keeping him alive, behind a loose panel in the back of a closet. A dozen cheap notebooks filled edge to edge in a cramped, worsening, desperate hand. 3 years of them. And I sat on the floor of a dead boy's bedroom and read the private record of his ruin, and it was the hardest reconnaissance I have ever done, because it was not a target I was building. It was a witness I was meeting. The early notebooks were a child's grief, raw and enormous. A 14-year-old trying to write his way through losing his mother, pages and pages of missing her, of small memories set down so they wouldn't be lost, of a boy talking to a woman who couldn't answer. And then, threaded through the grief, the suspicion growing. The things that didn't add up about her death. The questions no one would answer. The doctor who wouldn't meet his eyes. The notebooks charted, in real time, a boy discovering that his mother had been murdered and that no one would let him say so. And then they charted what that did to him. The isolation, the disbelief, the slow horror of being called crazy for being right, of watching his own family reframe his accurate grief as instability, of feeling himself being turned, deliberately, into the very thing they accused him of. He wrote about it with a clarity that broke my heart, because he understood exactly what was happening to him and was powerless to stop it. "They're making me into the story they need," he wrote, in an entry maybe a year before he died. "Every time I try to prove she was killed, they use the trying as proof I'm sick. I can feel myself becoming what they say I am. I don't know how to be believed. I don't know how to be sane in a room where being right is the same as being crazy. Mom, I'm trying. I'm so tired. I don't know how much longer I can be right by myself." I closed the notebook and I sat in the dark for a long time. Because I had read 41 target files, and I had felt nothing reading any of them, that was the craft. That was the conditioning. You don't feel the people you're going to erase. And I could not feel this. This was the opposite of a target file. This was the interior of a person the world had erased, written by the person himself, and reading it I understood that Julian Croft had not been weak, or unstable, or ruined. He had been brave for 3 years, alone, telling a truth that cost him everything, refusing to stop being right even when being right was destroying him. He'd lost. He'd lost because he was a 14-year-old going up against a machine built by adults, with no allies, no craft, no power. But he had never once stopped being right, and he had documented his own destruction in a calloused hand so that someday, maybe, someone would find it and finish what he couldn't. I found it. I was the someone. And sitting on the floor of his room with his notebooks in my hands, I made him a promise I have kept, that his record would not be the diary of a boy who lost, but the evidence that convicted the people who beat him. Every notebook I later gave to the prosecutors. Julian Croft, called mad for 3 years, testified against his own murderers from beyond his own erasure, in his own calloused hand, and was believed at last completely. The boy who spent 3 years unable to be believed became, in the end, the most credible witness in the case, because a private record kept by a victim who had no idea anyone would ever read it is the truest testimony there is. He got to be right, out loud, believed, finally. I couldn't bring him back, but I could make sure that the last word on Julian Croft was not wastrel or unstable or disgrace. It was witness. It was right all along. It was brave. That's what his notebooks bought him, 3 years too late, through the hands of a stranger who found them and understood. Adebayo found me that evening, and there was something new in the old man's face. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. The specific look of a man who has watched someone act and found the acting worthy. "The whole city's talking," he said. "The framed orphan. They're saying the family—" He shook his head wonderingly. 3 years I watched them build that boy into a monster, and you took it apart in a week without lifting a finger. Madame Isabella used to say the loudest weapon in any room is the quietest person in it. I never understood it until now." He paused. "The master had a good day today. First good day in months. The medicine down the sink, it's working. He asked for you. He hasn't asked for his son in a long time." I went to see Benedict Thorne, the dying father who was, thanks to a sink and an old man's courage, dying a little less. And that visit is the next chapter, because it's where the job stopped being a job, and where I learned the thing about the boy whose face I wore that turned a professional dismantling into something I'd have burned the world to finish. But move 1 was complete. The frame was destroyed. The father was alive. The pieces had jumped, and I'd read every one, and the board was mapped now to its foundations. 2 moves left, and I finally knew exactly where to aim them. Act 4, The House of Voss. Benedict Thorne was more lucid than he'd been in months, Adebayo said, and I could see it, a man surfacing slowly from a fog he didn't know he'd been drowning in, because for the first time in 4 months, no one was pouring the fog into his evening cup. He was still weak, still gray, still years older than his age, but his eyes, when they found me, were awake, and there was a person behind them, and the person was in agony. "Julian," he said. And then, before I could answer, his face crumpled, and this dying, manipulated old man began to weep, and he said the thing that rearranged the entire job for me, the thing that turned Julian Croft from a stranger whose face I wore into a boy I would avenge as though he were my own. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, son. I believed them. I believed every word. They told me you'd gone bad, that grief had ruined you, that you were drinking and fighting, and I stopped defending you. I stopped seeing you. My own son. And I let them make me stop looking at you, right when you needed me most, right after your mother—" He couldn't finish. "I've been so tired, so confused these last years. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't hold on to anything. And they were always there, so helpful, so concerned, telling me what to believe about my own boy. And I believed them because believing them was easier than the truth, which was that I was failing you and too weak to stop. Can you forgive me? I don't deserve it. I turned away from you. A father turned away." I sat with a weeping, dying man who thought he was apologizing to his son, and I did the thing I have almost never done in 40 years, because it cost nothing, and it was, for once, entirely true. "There's nothing to forgive," I said. "You weren't weak, Benedict. You were poisoned. Not just the medicine, though there's that too, and we'll get to it. You were poisoned against your own son by people who spent 3 years dripping it into your ear the same way they dripped it into your cup. A man can't see clearly through that. It's not a failure of love. It's a crime committed against your love, and against your judgment, and against your son, by people who understood that the surest way to steal a boy's inheritance was to first steal his father's belief in him." I held his frail hand. "You didn't turn away from your son. Someone turned you. There's a difference, and it matters. And I need you to hold on to it, because I'm going to need you clear-headed, and I'm going to need you to stop blaming yourself, because the blame belongs to them, all of it. And I'm going to make very sure they get every ounce of it." And then Benedict Thorne told me about Julian, the real Julian. And I want to tell you, because it's why the rest of this happened the way it did. Julian Croft had not been a monster. Julian Croft had been a bright, gentle, grieving 14-year-old boy who worshipped his mother and lost her, suddenly, without warning, and who then watched his entire family close ranks not around his grief, but against it. Isabella Reyes had died of a sudden cardiac event. That was the official story. 3 years ago, a healthy woman in her 40s dead overnight. And Julian, even at 14, even drowning in grief, had not believed it. He had said so, loudly, to anyone who would listen, and eventually to people who wouldn't. He'd said his mother was murdered. He'd become obsessed with proving it. And that, I understood now, the whole ugly architecture of it clicking into place, that was the origin of everything. The descent of Julian Croft had not begun with drinking and fighting. It had begun with a 14-year-old telling the truth that no one wanted told, and the family's response had not been to comfort him or to investigate. It had been to reframe him. A grieving boy who insists his mother was murdered is a problem. But a disturbed, unstable, drunken boy who makes wild, paranoid accusations is a diagnosis. So they took a child's accurate, grief-stricken suspicion, and they built it over 3 years into a story of madness. Every time Julian pushed toward the truth of his mother's death, they used the pushing itself as evidence of his instability, until the boy was so isolated, so disbelieved, so systematically driven toward the very behaviors they'd accused him of, that he became, at last, the wreck they needed him to be. They didn't just steal his inheritance. They took his true and desperate love for his murdered mother, and they weaponized it into the proof of his unfitness. They made his grief the instrument of his destruction. He kept saying it, Benedict whispered. Even at the end, even after everything, even drunk and broken, he'd look at me sometimes with those eyes, her eyes, and he'd say, "She didn't just die, Dad. Someone killed her. Why won't anyone look?" And I'd told myself it was the illness talking, the instability, because the alternative, that my son was telling the truth and I was married to the people who'd done it. He shuddered. I couldn't hold that. So I didn't. God forgive me. I chose not to be able to hold it, and my boy carried the truth alone for 3 years while I called it madness. Isabella Reyes had been murdered. Julian had been right the entire time. The whole 3-year destruction of the boy had been, at bottom, a cover-up, the systematic discrediting of the one witness who suspected the truth, so that when he inevitably tried to expose it, no one would believe a word the unstable heir said. And the same people were now finishing the job, murdering the father the slow way, disinheriting the son the clean way, and preparing to inherit an empire built on 2 murders and a boy's ruined mind. I sat in that room for a long time after Benedict fell asleep, exhausted by his own lucidity. And I did something I had not done in 40 years. I grieved. Not for anyone in that house. I'd never met the real Julian, never met Isabella. I grieved for the shape of it, for the specific horror of a child who told the truth and was called mad for it, who loved his mother so much he couldn't let her murder go, and whose love was turned, patiently, into the knife that gutted him. And under that grief, I grieved something older, something I'd sealed away so long ago I'd forgotten it had a door. Because I knew that boy. Not Julian specifically, the shape of him. The child whose truth no one wanted, who was isolated and reframed and made into a weapon by adults who found his real self inconvenient. I had been that child. I don't talk about who I was before I was the king. There's a reason the world knew me only by a code name, because the boy who existed before the weapon was erased so thoroughly that even I had mostly stopped believing he'd been real. But I'll tell you this much, because Julian Croft earned it by dying so that I could wake up in his life. I was an orphan too. I was taken, young, by people who saw in a bright, isolated, grieving child not a person to protect, but a resource to shape. And they spent years turning me into exactly what they needed. Patient, precise, obedient. A weapon that felt nothing because feeling had been trained out of it as a liability. They took a boy, and they made him into an instrument. The same way the Vosses took Julian and made him into a diagnosis. Different methods, same crime. The murder of a child's real self by adults who wanted what the child could be used for. I had spent 40 years being the weapon they made, 41 contracts, and I had told myself the whole time that I felt nothing, that the boy was gone, that there was only the craft and the target and the clean, quiet work. And it had been true, mostly, for 40 years. And then I woke up in the body of a boy who'd been destroyed the same way I was, in a house full of the people who did it, holding the exact skills needed to take them apart. And I understood, sitting by his sleeping, poisoned father, that I had not been sent here by accident, if sent is even the word, if any of this has a reason. I had been the weapon that adults make out of murdered children. And I had woken up in the body of a murdered child, with one last job. And the job was the reverse of everything I'd ever done. For 40 years, I'd been the instrument that powerful people used to erase inconvenient truths and inconvenient people. Now, for once, in a borrowed life, with a borrowed face, I was going to be the instrument that erased the powerful people who'd done exactly that to a boy like the boy I used to be. It was the first job I'd ever taken that no one had hired me for. It was the first one that was mine. And it was, I understood, the only one that had ever mattered, because it was the one where the weapon finally got to choose its own target, and chose, for the first time in 40 years, to protect a child instead of to be one who was used against him. I came to know Isabella Reyes, strangely, more intimately than I've known almost anyone alive. And I never met her. I knew her through the shape of what she left, the recording, the case, the strategy, the way she'd anticipated her own murder and armed her son across 3 years and her own death. And knowing a person through the trap they built to outlive their own murder is a peculiar and profound kind of intimacy, because a person's true self is never clearer than in what they do when they know they're going to die and choose, instead of despair, to protect. Adebayo told me about her, in pieces, over those weeks, and every piece confirmed what the steel case had already told me. Isabella Reyes had built the fortune the family lived on, and she'd built it out of a mind that never stopped working and a spine that frightened the men around her, in an era and a family that had no idea what to do with a woman who was simply better than they were. She'd married Benedict, a good, weak, kind man, precisely because he was the one man in her world who didn't need to diminish her to feel large beside her. And she'd had one child, Julian, and poured into him not the ambition everyone expected, but something rarer. She'd taught him to see, to watch, to notice what was true, even when everyone around him insisted otherwise. She used to say, Adebayo told me, that the whole world runs on people agreeing not to notice things, and that the bravest thing a person can do is keep noticing after everyone's told them to stop. He paused. That's why the boy couldn't let her death go, sir. She raised him to notice, and then she was murdered, and he noticed. Exactly the way she taught him, and they destroyed him for it. In a way, the thing she gave him, the seeing, was the thing that got him killed. And the thing she left in that case was her trying, from beyond death, to make sure the seeing finally counted for something instead of just costing him everything. That's the part that undid me, and it's the part that made Isabella Reyes feel less like a case and more like a person I was grieving. She'd raised her son to see, and it had destroyed him. And she must have known, building that case in the last week of her life, she must have known that the same clarity she'd given him was the thing that would put a target on him after she was gone. And she left him the weapon anyway, with instructions to use it wisely, because the alternative was to teach him to stop seeing, to be safe, to look away. And Isabella Reyes would rather have armed her son for a war than taught him to be blind. I understood that choice completely. It was the choice of a person who believed that a life spent noticing the truth, even at terrible cost, was worth more than a life spent safely asleep. It was, I realized, the exact opposite of the choice the organization made for me. They took a boy who saw, and they trained the seeing into a weapon they could aim, while Isabella took a boy who saw and tried to leave him the means to aim it himself, at the people who deserved it. Same gift, the seeing. Opposite intentions. One made a slave, one tried to make a free man. And I, standing between the two, a slave finishing a free man's work, felt the whole tragedy and the whole grace of it at once. When it was over, when Duncan was convicted and the name was cleared, Benedict held a memorial for Isabella, a real one, 3 years late, the one she'd never properly gotten because her murder had been disguised as a natural death and her son's grief had been reframed as madness. And at that memorial, I did the one thing I'd promised her steel case I would do. I made sure the truth of her was spoken aloud, not just that she was murdered, but who she was. The builder, the mind, the woman who raised a boy to see and armed him from beyond the grave. I made sure Ashford City, which had known her only as Benedict Thorne's clever wife, learned that it had lived, for 20 years, in a city she'd half built and never been credited for. It was the least I could do for a colleague I never met, a mother whose son's life I was living, a woman whose professional instincts had reached 3 years past her own death to make justice possible. She'd have understood everything I did. She'd have done it exactly the same way. And I like to think that somewhere, in whatever's left of a person after they've arranged their own vindication from beyond the grave, Isabella Reyes knows that her case was opened at last by the right kind of hands. Quiet ones, patient ones, that never once had to be raised. I found Adebayo in the dark hallway outside Benedict's room. You said she left a weapon, I said. Isabella, something she told you to keep safe for her son. It's the murder, isn't it? She knew. She knew they were going to kill her, and she left proof. Adebayo nodded slowly. She came to me a week before she died, calm as anything. She said, Adebayo, if I die suddenly, it won't be sudden, and it won't be natural, and my son is going to know it even when no one believes him. She gave me a case, told me to hide it where Duncan would never find it, and never to give it to anyone but Julian, and only when he was old enough and strong enough to use it right, because used wrong, she said, it would just get him killed too. The old man's eyes were wet. I've kept it 3 years. I watched them break the boy, and I kept it hidden because the boy they broke could never have used it right. It would have gotten him killed. She was right about that too. But you, he looked at me, and the last of his hesitation fell away. "You're old enough. Whatever you are, however old that body is, you're the oldest soul I've ever met, and you're strong enough, and you're careful enough, and you're on the boy's side." She said give it to Julian when he's ready. I think, in the only way that matters, Julian is finally ready. Come with me. It's time you saw what your mother left you. And I followed the old man down into the dark of the house, to the hidden weapon of a murdered woman who had known, a week before her death, exactly what her family was, and had reached forward 3 years to arm the son she couldn't save, not knowing that the son would be gone by the time it mattered, and that the hand that finally closed around her weapon would belong to a killer who had, at last, found the one target worth being made for. Act 5. The second move. Isabella Reyes's weapon was a slim steel case, and inside it was the most professional piece of work I have ever seen produced by someone who wasn't in my trade. She had known she was going to be murdered, and instead of panicking or fleeing or making the fatal amateur's mistake of confronting her killers, Isabella Reyes had done the thing a professional does. She had documented. In the case was a recording, her own voice, calm and precise, made a week before her death, naming Duncan Steele as the man she believed intended to kill her, describing the financial motive in exact detail, and predicting the method. "It will look like my heart," she said on the recording, in a voice with no fear in it, only a terrible clarity. "Duncan has access to my medications. He is patient, and he is careful, and he will make it look natural, the way he makes everything look natural. When it happens, my son will know it wasn't natural, because I'm going to tell him, and Duncan will spend years making sure no one believes my son, because that's what Duncan does. He doesn't kill the truth. He kills the credibility of whoever holds it." There was a pause on the recording, and then, "Julian, if you're hearing this, you were right, and I'm so sorry you had to be right alone for so long, and I need you to be smarter than your grief. Don't accuse them. Accusing them is what they're prepared for. Use this the way I'd use it, quietly, completely, when you can prove all of it at once, in a room they can't leave." She had, in other words, left her son not just proof, but a strategy, the exact strategy I'd already chosen, because Isabella Reyes and I turned out to be the same kind of mind, and I felt, listening to a dead woman lay out my own methodology, something close to grief for a colleague I'd never met. And there was more in the case. Financial records, Duncan's movements of Voss assets, positioned for a takeover that only made sense if both Benedict and Julian were removed. The name of the poison and its source. And, most valuable of all, the identity of the intermediary Duncan used for his dirty work. A fixer named Finch, a man I actually knew of from my old life, a mid-level facilitator, the kind of man who arranges things for people too important to be seen arranging them. I had, in that steel case, enough to destroy Duncan Steele completely. And I did not use it. Not yet. Because a weapon revealed too early is just a warning, and because Move 2 was not about destroying Duncan. Move 2 was about making sure that when I finally aimed the weapon, Duncan would be standing alone, stripped of every ally, with no one left to help him, and no one left who'd believe his side of anything. You do not fire on a fortress. You wait until the fortress has emptied itself, and then you walk in through the open gate. So I put Isabella's proof back in its case, and I hid it again, and I spent the next 2 weeks doing the quietest, most patient work of the entire job, turning the conspirators against each other, one careful whisper at a time, without any of them ever seeing my hand. The principle of Move 2 is simple, and it's the same principle I used on 41 contracts. People who have conspired together are held together by exactly one thing, and it is not loyalty. It is mutual trust in a shared outcome. Every conspirator believes the others need the plan to succeed as much as they do. Poison that belief, make each one suspect that another is planning to betray them, to take more than their share, to cut them loose when the time comes. And the conspiracy doesn't need to be attacked. It devours itself, because underneath every alliance of guilty people is the private certainty of each that the others are exactly as guilty and exactly as willing to betray, which means the suspicion, once planted, is always believed, because it's always, at bottom, true. I started with Liam because he was the weakest and the most frightened and the most useful, and because a frightened beneficiary is a door into everyone else. I did not threaten Liam. I helped him. I found him after the frame collapsed, cornered and sweating, and instead of frightening him further, I offered him, quietly, a way out. Not for his benefit, for mine. But he didn't need to know that. "You're not the architect of this," I told him. "I know that. You're a 19-year-old whose mother tied him to a scheme he didn't build and can't control. And now it's collapsing. And when it goes down, do you think Duncan is going to protect you? You're not blood. You're Clara's son, not his. When this ends badly, and it's ending badly, Liam, you can feel it, Duncan is going to need someone to hand to the wolves. And it's not going to be himself, and it's not going to be his own name. It's going to be you and your mother, the outsiders, the ones who can be sacrificed to make the Voss name clean again." I let him sit with it. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just telling you what I'd do in Duncan's position, and I think you already know I'm right, because I think you've already seen the way he looks at you when he thinks you're not watching. Like inventory, like a thing he'll spend when he needs to." I wasn't lying. That was the elegance of it. Everything I told Liam was true. Duncan absolutely would sacrifice him. That's exactly what men like Duncan do with pieces like Liam. I didn't have to fabricate a betrayal. I just had to make Liam see the real one that was coming, ahead of time, so that he'd move first. And a frightened piece who's been shown his own coming sacrifice does the most useful thing in the world. He starts protecting himself, which means he starts documenting, hedging, quietly gathering his own evidence against the others so he has something to trade when the wolves come. Liam began, without my ever asking, to build a case against Duncan and his own mother for his own survival. I'd turned a conspirator into an informant simply by telling him the truth about his own position 1 week before he'd have figured it out himself. Then Clara. Clara was a principal, brittle and invested, and Clara's weak point was that she believed she was Duncan's partner. She wasn't. She was Duncan's instrument, exactly like Liam, exactly like Vance, a useful figurehead who'd be discarded the moment the empire was secure. And Clara, unlike Liam, was proud, which made her both harder to turn and more explosive when turned. I didn't approach Clara directly. That would have been clumsy, and she'd have run to Duncan. Instead, I arranged for Clara to overhear a thing, a careful, deniable thing, a fragment of a conversation between Vance and one of Duncan's people, staged by me through intermediaries, in which Duncan's long-term plan was discussed in a way that made unmistakably clear that Clara and Liam were to be eased out once Benedict and Julian were gone, their usefulness expended, the second wife and her boy quietly pensioned off so the true Voss blood, Duncan, could consolidate. Clara heard exactly what I needed her to hear, believed it completely because it was true, and did precisely what a proud, betrayed principal does. She stopped trusting Duncan and started planning against him, and started, like Liam, gathering her own protection. And Vance, the fixer, the tool with no loyalty, Vance I didn't even have to turn. I just had to make it visibly more profitable to abandon the sinking scheme than to ride it down, which the collapse of the frame had already begun to do. I made sure through channels that Vance understood two things: that Duncan's plan was failing, and that a certain very careful new player in the Voss house was the kind of person who remembered which fixers had jumped early and which had gone down with the ship. Vance, being exactly the instrument I'd read him as, jumped. He began quietly distancing himself from Duncan, preserving deniability, positioning to be a witness rather than a defendant when the reckoning came. Do you see what move 2 is? I never attacked the conspiracy. I never confronted a single conspirator. I simply told each of them a true thing about their own position that they'd have realized too late, and I let the truth do the work, because a conspiracy of guilty people is a structure held together by mutual trust, and mutual trust among the guilty is the most fragile thing in the world, because every one of them already knows in their heart exactly how guilty and how disposable they all are. Within 2 weeks, without my hand ever showing, Duncan Steele's beautiful 3-year conspiracy had 4 people in it who no longer trusted each other, each one quietly gathering evidence against the others, each one preparing to betray the rest to save themselves. The whole structure held together now by nothing but momentum and the private terror of 4 people who'd finally understood they were in a boat with 3 other people who'd all throw them overboard to lighten the load. There was one manipulation in Move 2 that I'm particularly proud of, because it required me to do nothing at all except arrange a single dinner and let human nature do the rest. I needed Clara and Duncan to be seen distrusting each other, not just to distrust each other privately, which I'd already arranged, but to display it, publicly, in front of the board and the family, so that when the final room came, no one would believe they'd acted in concert, and each would be motivated to sink the other. Private distrust is useful. Public distrust is a weapon. And you cannot order two people to publicly distrust each other. You can only build the conditions under which their private distrust becomes impossible to hide. So I arranged a family dinner. That's all. A formal Voss family dinner, ostensibly to heal the family after the difficult events, which everyone felt obligated to attend and no one wanted to. And then I did 3 small things, each one invisible, each one deniable. I made sure Clara heard, an hour before dinner, a fresh fragment suggesting Duncan had met privately with Vance that afternoon, a meeting that would only matter if Duncan were planning something that excluded her. I made sure Duncan received, through a different channel, a document that suggested Clara had begun quietly consulting her own lawyer, which she had, at my earlier prompting, but which Duncan would read as a wife preparing to betray the scheme. And then I simply seated them across from each other, and I sat back, and I watched 2 guilty people who had each just been given fresh evidence that the other was moving against them try to eat dinner and pretend everything was fine. It's an extraordinary thing to watch if you know what you're watching. On the surface, a pleasant family dinner. Underneath, 2 predators who've each just been told the other is circling, each performing normalcy while their eyes did the real work. The 2 long glances, the 2 careful courtesy, the specific brittleness of people saying warm words through cold suspicion. The board members present, who knew nothing of what I'd arranged, simply felt it, the way you feel a storm coming without being able to name it, that something was wrong between Clara and Duncan, that the family's united front had a crack in it, that these 2 people did not, whatever they claimed, trust each other. I didn't have to say a word. I just had to seat them, arm them with mutual suspicion, and let them broadcast, through 100 tiny involuntary signals, the truth of their own fracture to a room full of people whose later testimony would matter. By the end of that dinner, without my hand ever showing, it was established, in the memory of every witness present, that Clara and Duncan were at odds, that the conspiracy, though no one yet called it that, was not a united thing, that these were 2 people who might, under pressure, turn on each other. When the final room came and they did turn on each other, no one was surprised, and everyone believed it, because they'd seen the crack forming with their own eyes at a dinner they thought was about healing. That's the deepest principle of Move 2. You don't just turn your enemies against each other, you make sure the turning is witnessed in advance, so that when it happens in the open, it reads not as a desperate ploy, but as the surfacing of a truth everyone had already sensed. I didn't destroy their alliance. I made their alliance destroy itself, on schedule, in public, at a dinner I hosted and barely spoke at, having arranged nothing anyone could ever trace to me except the seating chart. Adebayo served that dinner. Afterward, clearing the plates, he paused by my chair and said very quietly, "I've seen a lot of dinners in this house, sir. That's the first one I've ever watched a man win without saying anything." He shook his head. "You sat them across from each other and let them do it to themselves. Madame Isabella would have." He stopped and smiled, a real smile, the first I'd seen from him. "She'd have understood exactly what you just did. She used to say the same thing you do, that you never have to break people who are already holding knives. You just have to introduce them to the fact that everyone else in the room is armed." And Duncan felt it. Of course he felt it. He was the architect, and an architect feels the load-bearing walls shift even when he can't see who's cutting them. He didn't know it was me. I'd made very sure of that. Every whisper deniable, every push traceable to nothing. But he knew his own conspiracy was coming apart around him, his instruments turning brittle and suspicious. And he did what a truly dangerous man does when he feels his careful plan slipping. He stopped being careful. He decided to solve the problem the direct way. Adebayo brought me the warning, gray-faced, 3 days after Clara stopped trusting Duncan. "There's a man been asking about you," he said, "in the city. Quiet, professional, not police. Asking your movements, your habits, when you're alone." His old hands shook. "I've served this family 30 years and I know what that kind of asking means, sir. Mr. Duncan's given up on the clean way. He's going to have you killed, For real. An accident, probably, like the master, like Madame Isabella. He's going to remove you the way he removes everything, and make it look like the troubled boy finally did himself in, or wrapped his car around a tree, or... He couldn't finish. You've beaten his plan so badly he's abandoning it for the oldest plan there is. What do we do? You can't fight a professional killer, sir. You're a 17-year-old boy. Whatever else you are, that body can't. Adebayo, I said, and I felt something old and cold and almost fond wake up in me. The specific calm of a man who has just been informed that the game is about to move on to the one board where he has never, ever lost. Sit down. Have some tea. There's nothing to be afraid of. He's sending a killer. He's sending a killer to murder the king of assassins, I said, and he doesn't know it. Duncan Steele has spent this entire game making the same mistake everyone makes, looking at this body and seeing what he expects to see. I almost smiled. He built a beautiful conspiracy, and I took it apart with whispers, and now, at the end, cornered and frightened, he's decided the solution is to send a professional into my world, into the one arena where I am not a 17-year-old boy at all, where I am the thing that other killers tell stories about. I stood. He thinks he's escalating to violence because violence is the one thing the clever boy can't handle. It's the exact opposite. Everything up to now, I've done with my hands tied, playing a soft game in a soft world, being gentle, being patient, never raising a hand, because that world required it and because a raised hand was what they wanted. But a killer in the night? That's not their world. That's mine. And I have not raised a hand in this entire job, Adebayo, not once. Duncan Steele is about to give me a reason to remember exactly how, and to remind the whole hidden world I came from that the king never actually died. He just changed his face. Act 6. The King's Name. Let me correct something I said to Adebayo because I said it for his benefit and it wasn't quite true. And the truth is the whole point of who I am. I told him I was going to remember how to raise a hand. I said it because Adebayo was frightened, and frightened people need to believe someone strong is about to do something decisive, and because the image of the boy who could suddenly fight was a comfort to him. But it was a lie, or at least a misdirection, because the thing Adebayo didn't understand, the thing almost no one understands about my former profession, is that the king of assassins was not the king because he was the deadliest man in a room. I was the king because I was the man who never had to prove it. The brutes, the enforcers, the men who solved problems by being the most dangerous body in the building, they were plentiful, and they were replaceable, and they died young. Because a man whose whole value is his capacity for violence eventually meets a man with slightly more of it, or a bullet that doesn't care how strong he is. I outlasted every one of them, and I outranked every one of them, precisely because I understood that violence is the crudest and least reliable tool in the box. Anyone can be violent. The rarest and most valuable thing in my world was not the man who could kill you. It was the man you could not kill. The man so prepared, so untouchable, so completely 3 steps ahead that reaching him was suicide and everyone knew it. So no one ever tried. I built my entire legend not on the 41 kills, but on the 10,000 days no one dared to move against me. Because moving against me was understood, throughout the hidden world, to be the same as ending yourself. So when Duncan Steele sent a professional to kill the troubled boy, I did not prepare to fight him. I prepared to be recognized. The man came on the 3rd night, exactly as a professional comes, quietly, patiently, having watched for 2 days, choosing the hour when the house was asleep and the boy was alone. He was good, I'll give him that. I heard him at the window of Julian's bedroom the way you hear a change in a room you've mapped completely, and I did not reach for a weapon, because I don't need a weapon to survive a man, I need to survive being surprised. And I had not been surprised by anything in 40 years, and I was not surprised now. I was sitting in the dark when he came through the window, awake, facing him. A single lamp on, low, arranged so that he could see me clearly and I could see him, because a professional who comes for a sleeping target and finds a waiting one, lit, calm, expecting him, experiences a very specific and useful moment of doubt. And doubt in a professional is the only opening you ever need. You're early, I said. I expected you around 3. You're conscientious. That's rare. He froze, just for a heartbeat. A 17-year-old boy sitting awake in the dark, addressing a professional killer by his profession, in a voice with no fear in it at all. Everything about the scene was wrong, and a good professional's survival depends on things not being wrong, and I watched him recalculate. "Sit down," I said. "You're not going to kill me tonight, and I'm going to explain why, and then you're going to make a decision that will decide the rest of your life, and you're going to want to be sitting down for it, because the thing I'm about to tell you is going to be the strangest thing anyone has ever told you, and it's true, and some part of you already knows it's true, because a professional who's watched me for 2 days has already noticed that the target doesn't move like a 17-year-old boy." He didn't sit, but he didn't move either, which was the same thing. And then I told him, "Not everything. You never tell anyone everything, but enough. I used words that mean nothing to civilians and everything to men in his world. I named contracts that were legend in the hidden places, contracts that only 3 people alive had ever known the true details of, and I gave him a detail from each that had never been spoken aloud, that could only be known by the one person who'd done the work. I described a method, a signature, a way of arranging a room that every serious professional in the world had studied and no one had ever matched, and that had one author. And I watched a hardened killer's face go through the stages: contempt, confusion, unease, and finally the specific gray horror of a man in my world realizing which name he is standing in front of. "That's not possible," he whispered. "He's dead. The king is dead. He died 6 weeks ago. A truck, everyone." "Everyone knows," I agreed. "And everyone's right. He did die. And then he woke up here, in this, which I cannot explain and will not try to, and which you are going to have to simply accept, the way you accept anything in our world that would get you killed to disbelieve at the wrong moment." I let him hold it. "You came to kill a soft boy for a frightened uncle. Instead, you climbed through the window of the one man in the world you were trained your entire career to never, ever move against. Now, you have 2 choices, and I'm going to lay them out plainly, because I respect the craft and I respect you, and I'd rather you chose than forced me to choose for you." I stood, slowly, and he tensed, and I raised one hand, empty, palm out, the universal signal, and also a small joke only he and I would ever understand. The single raised hand of a man who had raised no hands. "Choice 1, I said. "You try to complete the contract, against me, and we find out tonight in this room whether the stories are true. I'll tell you how it ends, because I've been in this room 10,000 times, and you've been in it once. It ends with you, because it always ends with the man who prepared for years against the man who prepared for 2 days. You know this. It's why you haven't moved. Some animal part of you has already run the fight and lost it. Choice 1 is death, and slow professional that you are, you already know it. And choice 2? Choice 2, I said, is that you go back to Duncan Steele, and you tell him the boy is handled, the job is done. It just needs a few more days to look natural. You take his money, and then you disappear from his life entirely, and you never take another contract from him or anyone connected to him. And in exchange, the king of assassins, who is not dead, who is standing in front of you, who now knows your face and your name and your methods, the king owes you a debt, and forgets he ever saw you, and lets you live out a career under the protection of the one reputation in our world that no one dares to cross." I let that land because it was an enormous offer, the kind of offer that changes a professional's entire life. You climbed through the wrong window tonight. That's the worst luck a man in your position can have. But I'm offering to turn it into the best luck of your career, the night you accidentally did a favor for the king and got his protection for the rest of your life. All you have to do is the one thing you're already best at. Lie to your employer about a job, take his money, and vanish. You've done it 100 times. Do it once more, for the right side, and walk away richer and safer than you've ever been. He was quiet for a long time in the dark, weighing a choice that no amount of training prepares you for. And then the professional in him did the professional thing, which is the smart thing, which is the thing that keeps you alive. He chose to live. "The uncle," he said finally, "Duncan. He'll expect proof eventually, when the boy doesn't die." "By the time he expects proof," I said, "Duncan Steele will have much larger problems than you. In 3 days, he won't be in a position to hire anyone, or pay anyone, or threaten anyone. All you have to do is buy me 3 days of him believing the job is in progress. Can you do that?" "For the king," the killer said, and there was something almost like awe in it. The awe of a man who's just been touched by a legend he thought was only a story. "I can do that. It's—" He shook his head, still not quite believing the night he was having. "It's an honor. Whatever you are, whatever happened to you, it's an honor to have climbed through the wrong window." He went back out the way he came. And I sat in the dark, and I felt the strangeness of it settle over me, that I had just neutralized a professional killer, the most dangerous single threat in the entire job, without touching him, without a weapon, without so much as standing up fully, using nothing but the one thing 40 years had built that couldn't be taken away by dying: a name, and the terror it carried, and the craft underneath the name. I had not raised a hand, even here, even facing my own kind, in the dark, with my life on the line. Especially here, because raising a hand was never how the king won. The king won by making the raising of hands unnecessary, by being always the man against whom violence was simply, obviously, mathematically, a mistake. Duncan had sent violence into my world thinking violence was the boy's weakness, and my world had looked at his violence and, out of pure professional self-preservation, sent it home turned against him. I want to tell you about the contract that made me the king, because it explains why I could turn a killer with a conversation, and because it's the purest illustration of the thing my whole life was built on. Years ago, I won't say how many, there was a man so protected that 3 separate professionals had died trying to reach him. He lived behind walls, behind guards, behind a paranoia so total and so well-funded that he had made himself, by every conventional measure, unkillable. The men who'd tried before me had all made the same mistake. They'd treated him as a fortress to be breached, and they died on his walls, because his walls were genuinely better than their skills. The contract had become legendary in my world precisely because it seemed to prove that enough money and enough fear could make a man truly untouchable. I studied him for 11 months. I never went near his walls. I never touched a guard, never tested a defense, never did a single thing that his paranoia was built to detect. Because his paranoia was the strongest thing about him, and I have never in my life attacked the strongest thing about anyone. Instead, I watched for 11 months, and I learned the one thing his fortress couldn't protect. That a man that afraid, that walled in, that certain the world was trying to kill him, was a man being slowly destroyed by his own fear, and that the thing he wanted most in the world, more than safety, was for the fear to stop. His whole fortress was a prison he'd built himself, and he was dying inside it, and no one had ever offered him the one thing he actually craved, which was a way out. So I didn't breach his fortress. I offered him a way out of it, a route to a new life, a new identity, freedom from the people he was hiding from, delivered through channels he'd come to trust over those 11 patient months. And he took it, gratefully, desperately, because I'd spent 11 months understanding that his deepest need was not to be safe, but to be free, and I'd given him what he actually wanted, and he walked out of his own impregnable fortress on his own 2 legs toward what he believed was freedom, and into the only place I'd ever needed him to go, outside his walls, unguarded, having dismissed his own protection because I'd made him believe he no longer needed it. I never breached the fortress. I made him leave it. The 3 men before me died because they tried to be stronger than his walls. I won because I understood that the walls were beside the point, that every fortress has a person inside it, and the person has a need, and the need is the door. And the door is always, always unlocked from the inside, if you understand the person well enough to know which need to reach for. That contract made me the king, and it taught me the lesson I gave the killer in Julian's bedroom, the lesson that is the whole of my former trade. You never win by force. Force is what you use when you've failed to understand. The men who rely on force are the men who couldn't be bothered to watch, to learn, to understand. And understanding beats force every single time, because force can only break what's in front of it, while understanding can make the target break himself, or leave his fortress, or step off the last floorboard, or confess in a boardroom of his own apparent free will, having been given nothing but the specific truth about himself that his own nature couldn't refuse. That's why I never raised a hand at the Voss family. Not because I couldn't, because raising a hand is the amateur's confession that he failed to understand. Duncan Steele understood force. He'd have known how to fight a violent enemy. He'd sent a killer precisely because he expected the end game to be violent. What Duncan never understood, what the men who die on fortress walls never understand, what the organization that made me never understood even as they built the greatest understander of people the world has ever produced, is that the deadliest thing in any room is not the strongest hand. It is the mind that has watched you long enough to know which door you'll open yourself. I have that mind. I've had it since I was 7, when they made it, not knowing that the weapon they were forging was a weapon that would never need to be swung, because a weapon that understands you completely doesn't have to strike you. It only has to wait by the one door you can't help but walk through, and hold it open, and let you go free, right up until free is exactly where it needs you to be. Adebayo found me in the morning, having clearly not slept, braced for blood. And I told him what had happened, and the old man sat down heavily and stared at me, and he said, "You turned the killer they sent to murder you into your own agent, overnight, with a conversation." He shook his head slowly. "I keep thinking I've understood what you are, and then you do something that tells me I haven't come close." He was quiet. "Madam Isabella would have liked you, sir. She used to say the most dangerous person in Ashford City was whoever needed to prove it the least. She'd have looked at you and seen exactly what she meant. I have thought a great deal since about why the killer believed me, why a hardened professional, given the most impossible claim imaginable, chose to accept that a 17-year-old boy was the dead king of assassins. And the answer isn't the details I gave him, though the details helped. The answer is that he recognized something that can't be faked and can't be learned, something that only exists in people who have done what I've done for as long as I've done it. Stillness. There is a specific quality that settles into a person who has spent a lifetime being the most dangerous thing in every room. Not tension, not menace, the opposite of those. A profound, total stillness. The stillness of someone who has nothing left to prove and no reason to perform, because they have been, so many times, in the exact situation everyone else fears most, and survived it, that fear itself has simply worn away. The men who need to prove they're dangerous are the ones who aren't, quite. The danger and the proving are inversely related. Real danger is quiet. Real danger sits in the corner and watches and doesn't reach for the salt. The killer climbed through Julian's window, braced for a frightened boy, and instead he found a stillness he'd encountered only a handful of times in his career, always in the presence of people who could have ended him without hurrying, and his body understood what his mind refused to. That whatever was in that chair, it was not prey, because prey is never that still. That's why I never needed violence, in the Voss house or anywhere. The stillness does the work violence pretends to do, and does it better, because violence announces itself and can be prepared for, while stillness simply is and cannot be argued with, and unsettles people at a level beneath thought. Duncan felt it and overruled it with his pride. The killer felt it and, being a professional whose survival depended on trusting exactly that instinct, obeyed it. Clara and Liam and the whole house felt it without knowing what they felt. The wrongness of a soft boy who had become, overnight, the quietest and therefore most frightening presence in every room he entered. I didn't threaten anyone. I just stopped performing the fear they expected, and the absence of the performance was more terrifying to them than any threat, because a threat tells you where the danger is, and stillness makes you feel it everywhere. The organization understood this, in their cold way. It's why they took quiet children, a loud child, an angry child, a child who fights. That child becomes an enforcer, a brute, a tool that breaks and is replaced. But a quiet child, a watching child, a child who has learned to go still, that child, properly ruined, becomes the rarest instrument there is. The one that never has to strike, because its stillness does the striking. They made me still. They took a boy who'd gone quiet from loss, and they deepened the quiet into a weapon. And they were right that it was the deadliest thing they could forge. And they were wrong about only one thing, the thing they're always wrong about. They thought the stillness meant the boy was gone. That a person who has gone that quiet, that watchful, that still, has been successfully emptied. That there's nothing left inside the stillness but the craft. And for 40 years they were right, or close enough to right that the difference didn't matter. But the stillness was never emptiness. It was a room with the door shut. And behind the door, the whole time, was the boy who went quiet because he lost everything, waiting the way quiet things wait. The Voss job opened the door, and it turned out that the same stillness that made me the deadliest weapon in the world was also underneath the patience of a child who never stopped hoping that someday there'd be something worth being still for. Not prey to hunt, not a target to reconstruct, a garden, a father, an old man's terrible tea, a reason to keep watch that wasn't a contract. The stillness was always waiting for that. It just took 40 years and a dead boy's borrowed life for the thing worth waiting for to finally climb through the window instead of a killer. She left the same kind of weapon I'd have left, I said. Documented, patient, aimed to be used all at once in a room they can't leave. Your Madam Isabella had the instincts of a professional. If she'd been born into my world instead of hers, she'd have been a legend too. I stood, and she left me my third move without ever knowing it. She said, use it when you can prove all of it at once, in a room they can't leave. That's exactly what we're going to do. The frame is broken. The father's alive. The conspiracy's turned against itself, every one of them gathering evidence against the others to save their own skins. The killer's flipped. Duncan is standing completely alone now, isolated, cornered, 3 days from a proof that isn't coming. I felt the whole job draw down to its final, clean, inevitable point. Everyone in that house is now holding a piece of the truth and a reason to use it against everyone else. All that's left is to bring them all into one room, with Isabella's recording and Duncan's financial trail, and Liam's documentation, and Clara's grievance, and Vance's testimony, and a flipped killer's confession, and let the whole thing come out at once, in front of witnesses no one can silence, in a room Duncan Steele cannot talk his way out of and cannot walk out of clean. I looked at Adebayo. Move 3, the last one. Set the room. It's time the whole city met the real Duncan Steele, and the real Julian, and the real Isabella, all at once, in the last conversation this family will ever have as the thing it pretended to be. Act 7. Who he was. I said I don't talk about who I was before the king. I'm going to break that rule now, once, because you've come this far, and because the boy whose life I'm living earned the truth from me, and because you cannot understand the choice I was about to make in that final room without understanding the boy I stopped being 40 years ago. I was 7 when they took me. I don't remember my parents. I've been told they died, and I've been told they sold me, and I've never known which is true and long ago stopped caring, because both endings put a 7-year-old in the same cold building, learning the same cold trade. The people who took me were not a family and did not pretend to be. They were an organization, one of the old ones, the kind that manufactures instruments the way other businesses manufacture goods, and they had learned over generations that the best assassins are made not from cruel men, but from careful children, children who are bright and observant and, crucially, alone. Because a child with no one to love is a child with nothing that can be used against him, and a weapon with no vulnerabilities is the most valuable weapon there is. So they took bright, alone children, and they made us more alone, and they made us more careful, and they trained the feeling out of us the way you train a reflex out of an animal, not with cruelty, which produces broken instruments, but with a patient, total, systematic conditioning that taught us that attachment was death, that feeling was a liability, that the only safe way to move through the world was to want nothing, love no one, and watch everything. They were very good at it. They had made instruments for 100 years, and they made me the best one they ever produced because I had a gift for the watching, a mind that never stopped mapping the room, and because I learned the central lesson so completely that it became the whole of me. The man who needs nothing cannot be reached, and the man who cannot be reached cannot be beaten. And so the path to being unbeatable is to need nothing, love no one, and disappear. I believed it for 40 years. I proved it 41 times. I became a legend on the strength of it, the king who could not be touched because there was nothing in him to touch, no love to threaten, no attachment to exploit, no self to reach. They'd built me perfectly. A boy erased so completely that even I believed he was gone, leaving only the watching and the craft and the clean, cold quiet. And here is the thing I understood, sitting in Julian Croft's bedroom the night after I turned the killer, that I had spent 40 years not letting myself understand. It was a lie. Not a lie they told me, a lie I'd told myself, to survive what they did to me. The organization taught me that needing nothing made me unbeatable, and I'd believed it because believing it made the erasure of my own heart feel like a strength instead of a wound. But it wasn't strength. It was just the wound, dressed as a philosophy. I hadn't transcended attachment. I'd been robbed of it as a child by people who found my capacity to love inconvenient, exactly, precisely, the way the Voss family robbed Julian of his self by finding his love for his murdered mother inconvenient. The same crime. I'd recognized it the moment Benedict told me the boy's story because it was my story, and the recognition had cracked something in me that 40 years and 41 contracts had sealed shut. Because look at what I'd done, in Julian's life, in 3 weeks. I'd taken a side, for the first time. I'd chosen to protect a dying father and a murdered woman's memory and a grieving boy I'd never met, for no fee, for no reason the organization would have recognized, for nothing but the fact that a locked room and a frightened old man had reached across 3 years and asked me to. I'd let Adebayo matter. I'd sat at his table. I'd grieved for a boy. I'd felt something, standing by Benedict's bed, that 40 years of conditioning said was a fatal liability, and it hadn't made me weaker. It had made me, for the first time in my life, aimed at something that was mine. The organization had it exactly backwards, and I only understood it wearing a dead boy's face. Needing nothing doesn't make you unbeatable. It makes you a weapon, which is to say a tool, which is to say a thing that belongs to whoever holds it. I'd been unbeatable for 40 years, and I'd never once been free, because a man who needs nothing has nothing, and a man who has nothing has no reason not to be pointed at anyone, and so he is pointed, forever, at whoever pays. My invulnerability was my leash. The thing they told me made me a king actually made me a slave, the perfect slave, the one who guards his own chains and calls them strength. And now, in a borrowed life, I had accidentally done the forbidden thing. I'd let something matter. And instead of the fatal weakness the organization promised, I'd found the only power I'd ever had that was actually mine. Because a weapon that chooses its own target out of something it loves is not a weapon anymore. It's a person. For the first time in 40 years, taking about the Voss conspiracy, I wasn't a tool being aimed. I was a man who had chosen freely what to protect. And the choosing was the thing they'd spent my whole childhood making sure I could never do, because a person who can choose what to protect is a person who cannot be owned, and they were never in the business of making people. They were in the business of making instruments, and the one thing an instrument must never learn is that it could have been a person all along. I learned it at 40 years old and 6 weeks dead, in the body of a boy who'd been robbed the same way. There was a moment, near the end of that long night of understanding, when I went and stood in the doorway of Benedict Thorne's room and watched the dying father sleep, sleeping easier now, healing slowly, a man being unpoisoned back toward his own mind. And I thought about the fact that Julian was gone, truly gone. Whatever I was not the boy. The boy had died the night I woke up, and no dismantling of any conspiracy would bring him back. I was living a dead child's life, wearing his face, being called his name by a father learning to love him again, and an old servant learning to trust him. And I could have felt like a thief. A lesser man, or a more honest one, might have. But I understood, standing there, that I wasn't stealing Julian's life. I was finishing it. The boy had spent 3 years carrying a truth alone, driven mad by a love no one would let him honor, destroyed for insisting his mother was murdered. He died with the job undone, the truth unproven, the murderers unpunished, his mother's love still weaponized against him. And I, a weapon that had spent 40 years being pointed at truths exactly like Julian's, erasing them for pay, I had woken up in his body with the exact skills needed to do the one thing the boy couldn't. To prove it. To honor the love instead of letting it be used. To give a murdered woman justice, and a dying father his mind, and a grieving dead boy the ending he'd been robbed of. I wasn't taking Julian's life. I was the instrument that finally got aimed the right way, at the right targets, by the right hand, which was, for the first time in 40 years, my own. And if there is any meaning in the fact that a killer woke up in the body of a murdered child, it is only this, that the weapon they made to erase people like Julian got, at the very end, One chance to be the thing that saved one instead. One chance to point itself at the people who make instruments out of children and pull the whole thing down. I was going to take it. And then, this was the part I decided that night, the part that surprised me, the part that told me the boy underneath 40 years of ice was not, after all, entirely dead. And then I was going to try, for whatever years this borrowed life gave me, to actually live it. Not as the king, not as a weapon between contracts, as a person. A person with an old servant who'd become something like a friend, and a father to be a son to, and a family name to make clean again, and a murdered mother's memory to keep. The organization had stolen a boy's whole life and made a weapon. The Vosses had stolen a boy's whole self and made a scapegoat. And I was going to spend Julian's stolen life doing the one thing neither the organization nor the Vosses ever thought a made weapon could do. I was going to put the weapon down, when the job was finished, and simply be the boy they'd both tried to erase, the one who loved his mother and told the truth, and refused in the end to be only a tool. But first, the job. First, the third move. First, the room they couldn't leave. I went to find Adebayo, and to set the last piece of the board, and to give a murdered woman the ending she'd reached 3 years through her own death to arrange. The ending where her son, in whatever form he'd finally taken, walked into a room full of the people who killed her, and proved all of it at once, and did it, as she'd asked, without ever once raising his hand. Act 8. The third move. The room I chose was the boardroom of the Voss Group, and the occasion I chose was a meeting Duncan himself had called. That was the final elegance of it, and I want you to appreciate it because it's the purest expression of the whole philosophy. I did not summon anyone. I did not stage a confrontation. Summoning your enemies to a room puts them on guard, and a guarded enemy is a careful enemy. And I wanted these people comfortable, confident, sure they were winning, right up until the floor opened. So I let Duncan call the room. With Julian's birthday now 9 days away, and the frame destroyed and the conspiracy fraying, Duncan had convened an emergency meeting of the family and the senior officers of the Voss Group, ostensibly to discuss the troubling situation with Julian, to lay the groundwork for the incapacity petition he still, desperately, needed to file before the trust vested. He gathered the board, the family, Clara, Liam, Vance, the family physician, the whole machinery of the conspiracy, into one room, to plan my destruction. I simply made sure that when they were all assembled, every principle, every instrument, every witness, in one place on the record, on Duncan's own initiative, the meeting became about something other than what Duncan called it for. I arrived on time, which surprised them, and calm, which unsettled them, and I sat at the far end of the long table, and I let Duncan open the meeting. He did, smoothly, gravely, a concerned uncle addressing a difficult family matter, the tragic instability of young Julian, the recent troubling incidents, the family's painful duty to consider protective measures. He was good. Even now, cornered, he was good. He spoke of his love for his brother, his concern for the boy, the heavy responsibility of the Voss name. And the board nodded, and Clara dabbed her eyes, and Liam stared at the table, and I let all of it happen. Let Duncan build his whole solemn case in front of witnesses, because every word he said was a floorboard I was about to remove. When he finished, he turned to me, gravely, and offered me the chance to speak, expecting, I think, either a boy's furious outburst, which would prove his case, or a boy's tearful collapse, which would end it. He did not expect what he got. "Thank you, Uncle Duncan," I said. "You've made a very thorough case. I'd like to respond to it if the board will permit me. Not with emotion. I know that's what's expected of the unstable young Julian, and I don't want to disappoint anyone by being calm. But I've prepared some materials, and I think they're relevant to the question of who in this family is fit to control the Voss legacy. May I?" I did not wait for permission. I have never waited for permission in my life. I simply began, in the flat, precise, unhurried voice that had ended 41 lives and never once been raised, to remove the floor. I started with the smallest floorboard, because you always start small. You let them think they can still recover, right up until they can't. I presented the evidence of the frame. Maya Ashton's sworn statement, already public from the arraignment, but now laid out in full. Who paid her? How much? through which intermediary? I watched the board's faces shift from concern for Julian to a dawning discomfort, the first suggestion that the story they'd been told might have an author. Then I laid down the next board. The pattern. 3 years of incidents, presented not as a descent but as a construction, each one traced, where I could trace it, to a source, to a payment, to a Voss family hand. I didn't claim it. I simply showed it, incident by incident, and let the board see the shape that emerges when you lay a spontaneous decline out on a table and it turns out to be a schedule. The discomfort in the room became something colder. Then Liam. I didn't expose Liam. I'd turned him weeks ago, and a turned piece is worth infinitely more used than discarded. At the moment I'd arranged, Liam, pale, terrified, but doing the one brave thing of his life to save himself, spoke up and produced his own documentation, the evidence he'd been gathering against Duncan and his mother since I'd shown him his coming sacrifice. "I can't do this anymore," he said, voice shaking. "I was told Julian really was unstable. I was told we were protecting the family. But I've seen things, and I've kept records, because I was afraid, and it's here. It's all here. What Duncan asked me to do, what he asked others to do." A conspirator, breaking, in the room, on the record, handing the board a case against the architect to save himself. Exactly as designed. Then Clara, who I did not even have to prompt, because a proud, betrayed principal, watching the scheme collapse and hearing her own son turn, does the mathematics of survival in real time. Clara turned on Duncan in open board, furious, terrified, spilling everything she knew to position herself as a manipulated wife rather than a principal, and every word she said to save herself was another board out of Duncan's floor. And Duncan. I watched Duncan the entire time because Duncan was the target and everything else was just the approach. Duncan sat very still and did not panic, and watched his conspiracy dismantle itself around him with the cold, controlled attention of the architect he was. He knew, now, that this was me, that the soft boy had done all of it, and he was recalculating even now, even here, looking for the move that would let him walk out of the room, because men like Duncan always believe there's a move, right up until there isn't. So I gave him the last floorboard, and I gave it to him in a way designed to make him take the final step himself. Because the idea from the very beginning had been to make the architect expose himself, publicly, completely, and hand me the victory with his own hand. "There's one more matter," I said. "It's not about me, it's about my mother." The room went silent. 3 years ago, Isabella Reyes died suddenly of a cardiac event. She was 46 and healthy. Her son said at the time that it wasn't natural, and that son was called unstable for saying it, and the saying of it became the first brick in the case that he was unfit. I let that hang. "I'd like to play something for the board. It's a recording. My mother made it a week before she died." And I played Isabella Reyes's voice into that boardroom. I will not describe the whole of it again, you've heard it. But I watched it land, sentence by sentence, on a room full of people who had spent 3 years believing a murdered woman's son was mad for saying exactly what her own calm voice was now saying from beyond the grave. Duncan has access to my medications. He is patient, and he is careful, and he will make it look natural. When it happens, my son will know, and Duncan will spend years making sure no one believes my son. Every word a prophecy that had come exactly true, spoken by the victim, naming her killer, in front of the board he was trying to convince to declare her son insane for suspecting it. And then, the financial trail. Duncan's positioning of assets, meaningless unless both Benedict and Julian were removed. And then the family physician, who I'd reached quietly days before, and who under the weight of Isabella's recording and Clara's testimony and his own guilty terror, confirmed in that room that Benedict Thorne's recent decline was not natural, that the symptoms were consistent with exactly the kind of slow poisoning Isabella had described, and that the nurse administering the master's medication had been placed by Duncan. The floor was gone, all of it. Duncan Steele sat in a room full of witnesses, on a meeting he had called, surrounded by his own turned instruments, with his murdered sister-in-law's voice naming him and his poisoned brother's physician confirming him and his own financial trail convicting him. And there was no move left. And he knew there was no move left. And I watched the exact moment the architect finally understood that the boy he'd filed as prey had walked him, floorboard by floorboard, out over open air. And then he did the thing I'd built the entire room to make him do. He exposed himself completely with his own mouth, because a cornered architect who has run out of clever moves reaches, at the very last, for the only thing he has left, which is the truth he's been hiding, wielded as a threat. "You think this changes anything?" Duncan said, and his voice was low and cold and finally, fully honest. "You think a dead woman's paranoia, and a frightened boy's records, and a coward physician's guesses amount to anything against me? I built this family. I have run the Voss Group for 20 years, while my brother played figurehead and my sister-in-law played genius. Everything you're sitting in, everything you're worth, exists because I made the hard choices no one else would make. Yes." He stood, and he said it to the whole room, to the board, to the record, in a voice shaking with 20 years of resentment finally breaking loose. "Yes, I removed Isabella. She was going to take the company public, dilute everything, hand control to committees and shareholders. She was going to destroy what I'd spent my life building, and no one would stop her, so I stopped her. And yes, the boy had to go, because the boy was hers, all her, the same reckless sentiment, and he'd have done the same. And yes, Benedict was never going to make a hard choice in his life, and a man who can't make hard choices shouldn't hold what I've held. I did what had to be done. I have always done what had to be done, and not one of you—" He stopped, because he'd finally heard the silence, and he'd finally seen the small recording device in the center of the table that had been running since before he opened the meeting. And he'd finally understood that he had just confessed to 2 murders and 1 attempted murder, out loud, in front of the entire board and the family and the record, in a room he had called, provoked into it by a soft boy who had said almost nothing at all, who had simply, patiently, removed every floorboard until the architect, cornered and proud and 20 years bitter, stepped off the last one himself. I had not raised my voice. I had not raised a hand. I had barely spoken in the last 10 minutes. I had let Maya and Liam and Clara and the physician and a dead woman's recording and Duncan's own 20 years of resentment do all of it, arranging the room so that the truth came out of everyone's mouth but mine, and the confession came out of the one mouth that mattered, freely, provoked by nothing but its own pride and the specific unbearable feeling of a careful man watching his careful work come apart with no one to blame but the boy he'd underestimated. I want to slow down on the seconds after Duncan's confession, because there's a detail in them that matters more than the confession itself, and it's the detail that tells you what the whole 3 moves were really for. When Duncan stopped talking, when he saw the recording device and understood what he'd done, the room did not erupt. That's the thing people get wrong about how these moments actually go. There was no gasping, no shouting, no drama. There was silence. The specific, vast silence of a group of people all simultaneously revising everything they'd believe. The board members, who had walked into that room to plan the protection of the Voss legacy from an unstable boy, sat in the wreckage of that story and understood that they had been, all of them, instruments, that the concern they'd felt for the family, the pity they'd felt for the boy, the trust they'd placed in the reliable brother, had all been carefully manufactured by the one man among them who'd murdered his way toward everything. It's a heavy thing to discover you've been an unwitting piece in someone else's game. I watched it land on each of them, and I did not enjoy it, because there's no pleasure in watching decent enough people realize they were used. But I needed them to feel it fully, because people who have just discovered they were manipulated become, permanently, the most reliable witnesses against the manipulator. There's no zealot like a former dupe. And I watched Benedict. I'd brought Benedict to that room. Against Adebayo's worry, against the risk to his fragile health, I'd insisted that the father be present, in a wheelchair, weak but lucid, unpoisoned, himself. Because Benedict Thorne had spent 3 years being told his son was mad, and his wife died naturally, and his brother was loyal, and he had believed all 3 lies. And a man cannot heal from a wound he didn't see inflicted. He needed to hear Duncan say it. He needed to watch his brother confess to murdering his wife and poisoning him and destroying his son with his own eyes, in his own presence, so that the truth would be not a thing he was told, but a thing he witnessed. And when Duncan said yes, I removed Isabella. I watched Benedict Thorne's face, and I watched 3 years of manufactured confusion and false grief and misplaced trust break apart. And underneath it, rising, the clean, terrible clarity of a man finally seeing what was done to his family. He wept. But it was not the helpless weeping of the poisoned, confused man I'd met weeks earlier. It was the weeping of a man waking up, which is a different thing entirely. Grief, yes, but grief with its eyes open. Grief that could finally be grieved because it finally knew what it was grieving. That was what the 3 moves were for. Not the fortune. The fortune was never the point. And I made sure, when it was over, that it passed cleanly to a restored Benedict and a cleared Julian estate, out of the hands of everyone who'd schemed for it. Not even Duncan's punishment, though he earned every day of it. The 3 moves were for that moment on Benedict's face, the waking. A family had been destroyed by lies, and the deepest damage of a lie is not what it takes from you, but what it makes you believe. And the only cure for a believed lie is to witness the truth so completely that belief has no room left to hide. I built the whole room, all 3 moves, so that a poisoned father could watch his brother confess and finally, cleanly, know. Everything else, the board's revised testimony, the police at the door, the legal machinery, was consequence. The thing itself, the thing I'd actually come to give, was a witnessed truth, delivered to the people who'd been forced to live inside the lie, so that they could stop living inside it. That's the difference between what I did and what a violent man would have done, and it's the whole meaning of never raising a hand. A violent man ends the villain. I ended the lie. And ending the lie is the only thing that actually heals the people the lie was told to, because you cannot punch a family back into knowing the truth. You cannot shoot a father back into seeing his son clearly. You cannot stab away 3 years of manufactured madness. You can only build the room and remove the floorboards one at a time and let the truth come out of every mouth at once in front of the people who need to witness it until the lie has nowhere left to stand. And then the people who were trapped inside it walk out, blinking, into a world that is finally, painfully, true. No hand raised, no hand needed, just the truth, arranged so completely that it could not be unseen, delivered to the exact eyes that had been forced shut. The doors opened. I'd arranged that too. The police, the real ones this time, not Duncan's tame detective, waiting outside since before the meeting began, listening to a live feed of every word. They came in for Duncan Steele, and he did not resist, because there was nothing left to resist with, and as they took him past me, he stopped and looked at me, one architect to another, and asked the only question left. "Who are you?" Duncan Steele said quietly. "You're not the boy. I've watched that boy for 3 years. Who are you really?" And I gave him the same answer I'd given the killer, because it was the only true one, and because I wanted him to carry it into whatever came next. "I'm the one you should have looked at," I said. "You spent 3 years watching the boy so carefully, and you never once considered that the thing you were about to steal from might, someday, look back. That's the mistake, Duncan. Not the murders. The murders were competent. The mistake was thinking that because someone is quiet and soft and underestimated, there's nothing behind the face worth being afraid of." I held his eyes. "There's always something behind the face. You just have to be the kind of person who bothers to look. You never were. And that, not the recording, not the board, not any of it, that's what beat you. You built a whole life on never looking at the people you stepped on. And one of them, finally, was me." They took him out. And the room sat in silence, the board and the family and the record, in the wreckage of a 20-year lie. And I stood, and I gathered Isabella's steel case, and I walked out of the boardroom of the Voss Group, having taken apart a triple murderer and a 3-year conspiracy in exactly 3 moves, without a weapon, without a threat, without one single raised hand, the way the king always did it, the way a boy's murdered mother had asked, the quietest person in the room, walking out through a door that a very loud man could no longer use. Act 9. The Boy Who Lived. Duncan Steele was charged with 2 murders and 1 attempted murder, and the confession he'd given in that boardroom, recorded, witnessed, freely spoken, was the kind of evidence that no amount of money can unsay. He'd spent 20 years believing he was untouchable because he was careful, and he was undone, in the end, by the one thing carefulness can't protect you from, his own pride, provoked into the open by a boy who understood that the surest way to make a careful man destroy himself is to let him feel, just once, unbearably underestimated. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell. I feel nothing about that. I've never felt anything about the endings of men who murder children's mothers, and I've stopped pretending I should. Clara and Liam were spared the worst of it. They'd turned, they'd testified, and the law is gentler on the instruments than the architect, especially instruments who hand you the architect. They left Ashford City quietly, stripped of the fortune they'd schemed for, which was punishment enough for people whose entire crime was wanting a thing they hadn't earned. I didn't pursue them. Anya's ghost isn't in this story, but the principle I learned from a different life held here too. You don't destroy the ones who remove themselves. Liam, at the end, did the one brave thing of his life, and I've found that a single act of courage from a coward is worth protecting, because it's so rare and so hard-won. I let them go. I even, quietly, made sure Liam landed somewhere he could start over honestly. Not for his sake, for the sake of the person I was trying to become in a borrowed life, the kind of person who lets a coward's one brave moment be the start of something instead of the end. Vance vanished into whatever gray profession fixers vanish into. The flipped killer kept his word, took Duncan's money, and disappeared under the king's protection. And I've never seen him again, though once, months later, a package arrived with no return address containing a single chess piece, a king, which is the closest men in that world ever come to saying thank you. I kept it. It sits on Isabella's old desk now. Benedict Thorne lived. That's the part I'd save, if I could only save one. The poison, stopped in time, did not take him. He came back, slowly, over months, the fog lifting, the man returning, and the man who returned was not the diminished figurehead everyone had written off, but someone closer to who he must have been before grief and poison hollowed him out. He wept when he understood the whole of it, that his son had been right for 3 years, that his wife had been murdered, that his brother had done it, that he'd been slowly killed himself while his boy carried the truth alone. It's a heavy thing, to survive learning you were that wrong about that much. But he survived it, and more than survived it, he woke up, at the end of it, with a fierce, late clarity. And he devoted what health he'd recovered to 2 things: making Isabella's death publicly known and mourned as the murder it was, so that her name was cleared and her killer's confession stood in the full light, and being, for whatever years he had left, the father he'd failed to be. Which brings me to the strangest and most valuable thing I took from the whole affair, the thing a weapon is never supposed to get. I got to be his son. I want to be honest about the shape of this because it's not a simple happy ending and I won't pretend it is. Julian Croft was gone. I never stopped knowing that. The boy who loved Isabella, who told the truth and was called mad for it, who died the night I woke up. He did not come back, and no justice I delivered brought him back. And there's a grief in that I still carry, the grief of living a life whose rightful owner will never get to see it made right. Some nights I feel like a caretaker in a house whose family has died, keeping the rooms warm for people who aren't coming home. That feeling never entirely goes away. I don't think it should. But here is what I came to understand. Being called son by a recovering father, and sir by an old servant who'd become the closest thing to a friend I'd had in 40 years. The life was Julian's, but the living of it now was mine to do, and I could do it 2 ways. I could do it as a weapon between contracts, cold and separate, waiting for the old world to call. Or I could do the forbidden thing, the thing the organization spent my childhood making sure I could never do, the thing I'd started doing without meaning to the moment I sat at Adebayo's table. I could let it be real. I could let Benedict's late fierce love land on me, even knowing it was meant for a boy I wasn't. I could let Adebayo's friendship be a friendship. I could keep Isabella's memory not as a case I'd closed, but as a woman I'd come, strangely, through her recording and her steel case and her professional's instincts, to love a little. The colleague I never met. The mother I was finishing the work of. I could be a person, in a dead boy's life, not stealing it, tending it. Living the years he was robbed of, as well and as fully and as honestly as I could, as the only way left to honor the fact that he'd existed at all. I chose that. It's the second real choice I've ever made. The first was choosing to take the Vosses apart, and the second was choosing, when the job was done, not to put the person back down and pick the weapon back up. People who learn even a piece of this story always ask the same anxious question. Aren't you afraid they'll find you? The organization, your old world, a weapon that walked away wearing a new face, surely they can't allow that. Surely someday, someone climbs through the window again, and next time it isn't a man you can turn with a conversation. Maybe. I've made my peace with maybe. But here is what the anxious question misunderstands. And it's the last thing I learned, the thing that turned the fear of being found into something almost like calm. For 40 years, I was afraid of exactly nothing, and it was the loneliest kind of safety there is. The safety of a man who has nothing to lose, which feels like freedom and is actually just emptiness wearing freedom's clothes. Nothing could threaten me because nothing could reach me because there was nothing inside me to reach. And now, for the first time, I have things I could lose. A father, a friend, a name, a garden. And the anxious question assumes that makes me weaker, that a man with something to lose is a man who can be threatened, which is the exact doctrine the organization built me on. The doctrine that says love is a vulnerability, and attachment is a door your enemies walk through. They were wrong, and I know they were wrong now because I've lived both ways. A man with nothing to lose is not strong. He's just already lost. He has nothing to defend because he has nothing, and a life with nothing in it cannot be taken because it was never really had. But a man with something to protect, that man is dangerous in a way the empty king never was, because now the stillness has a reason, now the craft has a purpose. Now, 40 years of being the most prepared and patient and untouchable thing in every room is aimed, at last, at something worth aiming it at. Let them come. They'll find the same quiet man they always feared, with the same reputation that outlives the body, with the same 40 years of craft, plus the one thing they spent my childhood making sure I'd never have, and the one thing that makes a man truly impossible to move against. A reason. They built a weapon that needed nothing. They'd be walking into a home defended by a weapon that finally, at the end of everything, has something to lose, and has decided it will not lose it, and knows, better than anyone who has ever lived, exactly how to make sure it doesn't. So no, I'm not afraid they'll find me. For the first time in 40 years, I have something worth them finding me for. And a killer who has finally found something worth protecting is not a retired king, waiting nervously for the past to catch up. He's the most dangerous thing in the world, sitting very still, in a garden, keeping watch, home, at last, and ready. The organization that made me is still out there. My old world still exists, and someday, perhaps, it will remember that the king's face changed rather than died, and come looking. If it does, it will find that the quietest person in the room is still quiet, and still prepared, and still not to be moved against. Because the craft doesn't leave you, and the reputation is a wall that outlives the man. But it will also find something the organization never made and never expected. A weapon that became a person, that has a father and a friend and a name to keep clean and a murdered woman's memory to honor. And that will defend all of it, not as a tool defends its owner, but as a man defends the only things he's ever chosen to love. And a weapon that has finally learned to love the things it protects is not weaker than the king who needed nothing. It is the most dangerous thing I have ever been, because now, for the first time, there's a reason. There was an evening, months into the after, that I think of as the moment I knew I'd actually chosen it, the person over the weapon, the home over the hunt. Benedict was well enough by then to sit in the garden in the evenings, and I'd taken to sitting with him, and Adebayo would bring tea, and the three of us, a recovering father, an old servant, and a killer wearing a dead boy's face, would sit in the dusk and not say very much, which is its own kind of intimacy, maybe the deepest kind. And one evening Benedict said, out of a long, comfortable silence, "You know, you're not the same. Since the arrest. I've noticed and I've decided not to ask, because whatever happened to you that night made you into the son I always hoped was in there, and I'm not fool enough to interrogate a gift. But you're not the boy you were." He was quiet. "I lost my son once, the real him, to grief and to their poison, long before that night. I've made my peace with the fact that whoever you are now, you gave him back to me better than I had any right to expect. So I'm not going to ask who you are. I'm just going to say, thank you for being him, for finishing what he couldn't, for letting an old fool who failed his son have a second chance to be a father to someone. Whoever you are, you're my son now. I've decided. And a man's allowed to decide who his family is, at the end, when the blood family turned out to be the ones holding the knife. I did not know what to say, which is rare for me. 40 years of knowing exactly what to say in every room, and I sat in a garden with a dying, then recovering man calling me his son, and I had nothing, because nothing I knew how to say was equal to it. So I said the only true thing I had. I spent my whole life, I said, being a thing that belonged to whoever held it. I never had a family. I was made specifically so that I never would, because family is a vulnerability, and I was built to have none. And then I woke up in your son's life, and I meant to just do the job and move on, the way I've always done, because moving on is the only thing I know how to do. I looked at the old man. And I can't. I don't want to. For the first time in 40 years, I don't want to move on. I want to sit in this garden and drink Adebayo's terrible tea and be your son and keep your wife's memory and make the name clean. I don't know how to do any of it. I'm going to be bad at it for a long time. But I want it, and I've never wanted anything, and I think wanting it might be the first thing I've ever done that's actually mine. Adebayo, pouring the tea, pretended very hard not to be listening, and failed. And I saw the old man's hands shake, and I let him pretend. The tea is not terrible, Adebayo said with dignity. It's a little terrible, Benedict said. 30 years I've made it exactly this way. 30 years it's been a little terrible, Benedict said, and the two old men bickered gently in the dusk, and I sat between them, a weapon that had put itself down, in a garden, in a life that wasn't mine, and had somehow become mine, and I understood that this